Hello everyone, welcome to AMH 2020 U.S. History Introductory Survey since 1877. In this video we're going to discuss America during the Great Depression from 1929 and 1930 until the end of the 1930s. We're going to talk about why the Depression begins, a bit more information about the Great Crash of 1929, and then we'll talk about the Hoover administration, their response to the Great Depression, attempts by President Hoover to mitigate the effects of this very severe economic downturn, the most severe economic downturn that we've ever had in this country. And we'll talk a bit about daily life in the Great Depression as well. What did everyday American families do to try to deal with the mass economic stagnation they were facing, mass deflation, mass unemployment, and environmental disasters that were occurring during this period. We'll discuss how they dealt with these things. Then we'll talk about the presidency of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We'll discuss his New Deal policies, and there are many New Deal programs. There was a lot of New Deal legislation. We're going to hit some of the highlights, some of the most significant New Deal pieces of legislation and programs, and some of the ones that are still around today, the alphabet soup as it was called during the period. And we'll talk about really how these programs really begin to redefine Americans' relationship with the government, specifically the U.S. federal government. And we'll also discuss the New Deal itself. We'll discuss FDR, his political beliefs, how liberal was he, how conservative was he, what was the effect of the New Deal on the Great Depression. Did the New Deal end the Great Depression? And we'll talk a bit about its final legacy as well, because some of these New Deal programs and laws are still in effect today. And the image on this slide is of a woman with her children. It's taken, it's from the Tennessee River Valley, circa 1936. This was a very impoverished part of the country, an area that was susceptible to natural disasters like floods. And you'll notice that the woman is actually wearing a skirt made from a flour sack. This was a fairly common thing. People would make clothing out of flour sacks because they needed to save every last piece of cloth that they could just to get by. Here's some general background about the Great Depression. The 1930s are commonly known as the decade of the Great Depression in U.S. history. In fact, you could argue that the Depression actually begins in 1929 when unemployment rates begin to increase as a result of the great stock market crash, and we're certainly in a state of depression by the beginning of 1930. And people debate exactly when the Great Depression ends. The Great Depression, the U.S. GDP returned to pre-1929 levels by about 1939 or 1940. But the unemployment rate did not return to a healthy level, healthy levels being below 5%. Until about 1942, and that was after the United States had officially entered World War II. So again, there's debate in history about exactly when the Great Depression begins, about 1929 or 1930, and there's also a bit of debate about when it specifically ends. The economy had regained its size by about 1939 or so, but unemployment rates did not get to a really good level until about 1942. And the Great Depression led American policymakers to seek to implement solutions to help the American people and to strengthen the American economy. This is a period in which the United States government is going to become much more involved in the economy, and it's not just going to be municipal governments and state governments, it's going to be the U.S. federal, the U.S. national government. And much of the legislation that you see coming out of the Great Depression, it comes from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR as he's often known, his New Deal. And the New Deal and FDR himself have their roots in the progressive era policies of the 1900s through 1910s. FDR had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy, actually, for President Woodrow Wilson during the progressive era. And here are some images related to the Great Crash of 1929. As you can see here, you can see the crash in October of 29. You'll notice the stock market does rally a little bit going into 1930, but it does not return to the pre-crash level, which is why some people, instead of saying the Depression began in 1929, they'll say it begins in 1930. And I discussed banking policy and monetary policy in the conclusion of my last video in the 1920s. So if you want to find out more about how the banking system and other factors helped to enable the Great Depression, you can check that out. But we go from a really strong stock market and a strong economy to a massive bear market and sell-off of stocks. And the Great Depression begins, unemployment increases significantly, and there's also going to be mass deflation of the U.S. currency, and there's going to be bank failures, and people are going to lose their jobs. And the Depression is fully begun going into the 1930s. So now we'll discuss President Herbert Hoover's response to the beginning of the Great Depression. Hoover, of course, had become president. He'd won the 1928 election. He was inaugurated in early 1929, and the Great Depression begins a few months into his presidency. Really, in some ways, he's one of the most unlucky U.S. presidents because he's left whole in the bag for the Great Depression. And in popular memory, and even at the time, many people thought of Hoover as a do-nothing that didn't try to make anything happen, didn't try to mitigate the negative effects of the Great Depression. That was the perception that many people had about Hoover and about his cabinet. They actually jokingly called Hoover and his cabinet the medicine ball cabinet because they were seen outside playing sports and throwing around medicine balls rather than trying to figure out how to fix the Depression. In reality, though, Hoover's conduct was actually much worse because his attempts to actually remediate the Great Depression really in many ways made the American economy weaker, and some might argue helped to make the Great Depression a more global economic downturn and not just a thing that was happening in the United States. So after the stock market crash, Hoover will meet with business and labor leaders, and he's going to ask both parties to work together for the good of the country. He asks these business magnates not to lower wages or stop work or lay people off, and he asked the labor unions not to protest or go on strike during this period. It's a good idea, but it's not enough. He's asking them to do these things, not telling them. And Hoover, in terms of the relationship between business and the government, he believed in something called the associative state or associativism. Basically, the government and corporations will work together to fix social problems, to keep the economy going, rather than having the U.S. government be in command of corporations. And really, this associative state, this is the system that's going to last in America. It's going to be the way the government and corporations and business work together today. It's the associative state. In some ways, Herbert Hoover kind of gets the last laugh, you might say, even if he does get blamed for making the Depression worse and for supposedly not doing anything. But as you can see, he does do certain things. He supported tax hikes of up to 60% on the highest earners. This was a direct reversal of the policies of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, who were very limited government, low tax. Hoover was a bit more of an old progressive era type of guy. He believed that the government should be more involved in the economy and it should work with corporations. And he believed these tax hikes, particularly on the highest earners, could fund government projects and get people back to work. He also supported things like mortgage assistance as well, because people were losing their homes because they're out of jobs, they're losing their wages. And the thing is, though, he believes the government can do these things, but he believes that it's state and local governments rather than the federal U.S. government. He thinks it's a constitutional issue to have the U.S. government be too involved. So he does believe in some government involvement, but it's the associative state. It's a partnership with corporations and government. And a lot of this stuff done by the government is handled by municipal and by state governments rather than the U.S. national government. He authorized infrastructure spending projects to put money back into the economy, to get people back to work. And he spent about $100 million. I think it's a good idea, but it wasn't enough. projects like the Hoover Dam are going to be constructed during this period, as there are projects to get people back to work. It wasn't originally called the Hoover Dam. It was called the Boulder Dam, and it was built from 31 to 36. And Hoover had sought to protect American industrial and agricultural interests through tariffs, agricultural tariffs especially. And this is also done to discourage the importation of foreign goods. That way, that money can stay in the U.S. economy, and Americans can go back to work, by buying American. The thing is, though, some would argue that Hoover went too far with the Smoot-Hawley Act in 1930. The Smoot-Hawley tariff drastically increased tariffs. It was put together by Reed Smoot of Utah and Willis Hawley of Oregon, and it increased tariffs from 40 to 60%. And although Hoover did sign the Smoot-Hawley tariff, he actually had a lot of criticisms of it. He said it was an obnoxious tariff, that it was going too far, and it was only going to anger our trading partners. So he may have supported it, but he did so with very severe reservations. But if he was so reserved about it, he should have just vetoed it. In fact, economists wrote to the president asking him to veto it. One economist said that he got on his hands and knees and begged the president at the White House not to sign the tariff. But anyway, in spite of his feelings, he signs the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and the act backfires as other countries, namely Canada and France, they're going to place retaliatory tariffs on American goods. So their economies are being hurt as well, and the Great Depression is going to become a much more global conflict, arguably because of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And one last point that I'll make about the Smoot-Hawley tariff is that some, particularly World War II historians, argue that the Smoot-Hawley tariff, the increase of tariffs, it affects Japan as well. They're going to no longer have as easy of an opportunity to sell in the American market, and because of that, they're also not going to be able to get the natural resources they need from America. And some argue this is a factor that leads Japan to invade Manchuria in 1931, kind of getting the ball rolling for World War II. This diagram here shows the decline of the U.S. economy. You'll notice the Smoot-Hawley tariff here. It doesn't actually help the American economy. Things will continue to get worse even after it is put into law. And again, American economists, they asked Hoover not to sign the tariff, but to veto it instead. But Hoover felt that even though he didn't like the Smoot-Hawley tariff, he felt he should still support it. And here's a comic showing President Hoover trying to mitigate the hard times of the Great Depression, doing so with scarecrows that look like the brainless scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz. And Hoover defends his conduct by saying, "It may not be perfect, but it will help quite a bit." Did it help quite a bit? I don't think so. In order to mitigate the mass unemployment that was taking hold in America during the Great Depression, reaching over 15% by 1931, Hoover supported a massive campaign against illegal immigration. His cabinet, especially Labor Secretary William Doak, believed that the repatriation or deportation of illegal immigrants or undocumented migrants, illegal aliens, whatever term you want to use. This will decrease the labor pool. That will be good for wages, and it will open up jobs for U.S. citizens. The thing is, many of the alleged illegal immigrants were not really from Mexico. They were actually U.S. citizens of Mexican ancestry born here in the U.S. So there was a racial or even racist element to the enforcement of this illegal immigration policy. In fact, some people think that about 60% of the deported people were not illegal immigrants at all. They were citizens of the United States born here of Mexican or mestizo ancestry. To be fair to Hoover, though, I will say that these deportations will continue even after Hoover is no longer president. Here are some images related to Mexican American and mestizo people in the American Southwest. Since the 1920s, with the Johnson-Reed Act, immigration into the United States had become much more difficult for anyone outside of Northwestern Europe, and in some cases, Mexican people would migrate to the U.S., work temporarily in agriculture, and then return to Mexico because the borders were more open and porous. But as the 1920s goes on, the border becomes tighter with the establishment of organizations like the U.S. Border Patrol, and as a result of changes to legislation. And so it becomes more difficult to go back and forth. So some of these people will choose to continuously reside in the United States, even if doing so is illegal. But many of the people who were deported, probably the majority actually, were not illegal immigrants from places like Mexico. They were actually born in the United States. I would say the worst, most controversial thing that Hoover did as president to try to deal with the fallout of the Great Depression was his suppression of the bonus army protest in Washington, D.C., which this took place on July 28th, 1932. It's an election year as well. Um, because of the Depression, many World War I veterans were struggling financially. They were in danger of losing their homes. Many had lost their jobs. And they wanted to have their military service bonus or pension be paid out right then. Legally, they were not supposed to receive it until 1945. The thing is, many of these people were in trouble now. They needed the money now. So they marched to Washington, D.C. They establish a shanty town, or you might call it a homeless encampment. Back then, in the Great Depression, they called them Hoovervilles. Anything that's bad in the 1930s, in the Depression era, it's Hoover something. Hooverville for a shanty town. Um, if you don't have a blanket to wrap up with, you use a newspaper. It's called a Hoover blanket. If you reach into your pocket and have no money, and you pull out the liner of your pocket, that's a Hoover hanky because you don't have any money because of Hoover. But Hoover witnessed the encampment of the bonus army marchers. They were set up along the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C. They were actually set up on and near some government buildings as well. And he was very concerned about this. He was concerned that left-wing radicals might be infiltrating the group. And this is largely based on hearsay. I think there probably were some radicals that did infiltrate the group over time, but I think that happened later. It wasn't this march didn't start out as a radical thing. It was about just getting this bonus that the veterans needed now. But as time goes on, perhaps some more radical people slipped in as some of the veterans are leaving and going back home. So um, by July, the president orders the D.C. police and the United States National Guard. Even some tanks are going to be used to clear out the bonus army encampment. 2 protesters are going to be killed. The tanks drove in. The marchers were attacked by the police and the National Guard. Tear gas was used. Really, it's not a good look for the president to be doing this in Washington, D.C. 2 veterans who have lost their homes. And he's doing it in an election year as well. And several future U.S. military officers like Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton and Douglas MacArthur took part in this dispersal. And here are images of the police and the military being used to break up the bonus army encampment and to destroy the Hooverville that the marchers had set up. You can even see the U.S. Capitol building in the background there in basically downtown Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. And now I'll begin to sum up the policies or the policy failures of the Hoover administration. There is a common misnomer that President Hoover did little or nothing to stop the negative effects of the Great Depression. I've argued that it was actually worse. Many of the policies that Hoover supported actually made things worse. Now, he did do some good things. He did try to help some people get back to work. He did try to help people stay in their homes. But people generally say that Hoover's policies were either ineffective or just they were too small scale. And of course, there were things that backfired, like the Smoot-Hawley Act, the mass deportations, which were misuse of resources and also targeted people who were actually U.S. citizens of Mexican ancestry. And these policies, they don't put enough people back to work. They don't halt the mass unemployment. And when it came to other policies in terms of spending, in terms of growing the power of the U.S. government, Hoover took more of a conservative, lowercase c approach to spending and growing of the government. He was opposed to deficit spending, although there was deficit spending during his presidency. He wanted to try to keep the United States on the gold standard, where U.S. dollars are backed with gold. Other countries, especially in Europe, had abandoned their gold standards after World War I in order to allow for more deficit spending to help their citizens. But that was something that Hoover did not want to do. He wanted to avoid sweeping changes to monetary policy. Also, Hoover refused to modify or cancel the Volstead Act, or really to call for its cancellation. He called it a noble experiment. And while he was known to have a drink when he was outside the United States, and the American public was really turning against Prohibition by the 1930s, he did not want to alienate religious voters. There were a contingency of white Protestant voters who still supported Prohibition for religious reasons. Not all religious people supported Prohibition, but this group of you might call them evangelical or even fundamentalist voters. They were a very important, well organized, and politically active voting bloc, and Hoover did not want to alienate them, even though getting rid of Prohibition would have been popular and it would have led to increased taxes and would have led to increased business. Here are some images of Hoovervilles across the country. These were set up in many urban centers where unemployment was very high, especially in northeastern and midwestern um, cities. Places like Cleveland, Ohio had nearly 90% unemployment as factories were laying off workers because they weren't able to do business. Nobody had money to spend. People will lose their homes and they'll set up these shantytown encampments, which were very dangerous places to live. A lot of crime, a lack of proper sanitation and facilities, but they were called Hoovervilles, particularly by the anti-Hoover press, um, blaming him for creating this poverty. And as I said, anything that's bad during this period, it's Hoover something. Hoover blankets when you're using newspaper for your bedding. If you're struggling to find a meal and you make a cheap soup out of leftovers, that's Hoover stew. And that one must have really burned Hoover, because in 1928 his campaign had promised a chicken in every pot for Americans and cars in every driveway. He promised prosperity to the American people, but now during his presidency, the United States has entered its greatest economic downturn ever. I want to touch a bit more on everyday life for people during the Great Depression. Everyday Americans really struggled during the Depression. Many had lost their life savings, um, or they had debts that they were struggling to repay because of the mass deflation, and many more were laid off from their jobs across the country. And all Americans, I think, suffered to some degree during the Great Depression, but the scholarship has found that the Depression was especially hard for children, the elderly, and racial and ethnic minorities. These groups of people were more vulnerable populations. In some cases, they had higher unemployment rates, and you can see where the Depression is hitting the hardest. And some, urban industrial centers had the majority of the population was unemployed. That's how bad it got to be in some of these cities. Many families had to have very difficult conversations and make very difficult decisions about supporting their grandparents and elderly relatives, or supporting their teenage sons, especially. And some families basically had to kick out their 18-year-old sons. They had to go out and fend for themselves and basically be homeless. Family breakups also were a big problem too, as men, husbands, fathers, breadwinners are losing their jobs. In some cases, they're so ashamed and so embarrassed they leave their families behind. So family breakups accelerate during this period. Religious service attendance appears to have gone down as well. churches and religious organizations are hurting too because they survive off of donations from attendees, and if attendees are out of work, those people need more help from a charitable organization like a church, but the religious organizations don't have the money to give to help their people anymore. And so cash-strapped Americans, they'll find all kinds of ways to be thrifty and to save money and to, do more with less. New recipes are developed. Everything is saved that can possibly be saved. For example, women would make dresses out of flour sacks. I showed you an image of a woman that had done that before. And this actually became so common that milling companies, this is towards the end of the 1930s, they began to actually print their sacks with flower patterns. That way, families would be more likely to purchase the flour that came in a really pretty, sack. And then that gives the family an opportunity to have some nicer clothing because there's already a pattern on the cloth they're going to be using. But you saved your tin foil, you saved packages and parcels. If you received something in the mail, you would save the string or the twine that held it together. My family, particularly on my mom's side, my mom's mom, they were very poor during the Great Depression. Lyman Bowman Sr., who I showed, my grandmother's father, his family really struggled in the Great Depression. In fact, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, her home didn't have internal plumbing. She had to actually sleep on the back porch, or actually it was just the porch because they were in a very small house. They couldn't afford a bigger place. So there was a lot of poverty in the Great Depression, and people had to adapt to it. And on the whole, things like fashion become a lot more plain and subdued, darker colors, longer skirts for women. It's really they're kind of rejecting the exuberant, conspicuous consumption that you saw in the 1920s flapper style. Really longer skirts, darker clothing, more muted patterns. This is what we call a recession indicator, and there's good evidence in fashion history that whenever there's tough economic times, women's clothing gets to be more subdued and skirts get to be longer. You even find that actually in ancient Greco-Roman history, believe it or not just in the 1930s United States. And to be thrifty, American women begin to develop new and inexpensive recipes and cooking methods to take advantage of some of the cheaper foodstuffs that are available. Things like canned fruit and canned vegetables. It's cheaper than buying fresh. If you can, you'll grow your own fruits and vegetables and raise your own livestock. That was something my grandmother's family did. Cheap processed meats, ground beef, things like bologna and hot dogs become popular in many recipes as well. Future U.S. President Richard Nixon, his family was very poor in the Depression. He said that practically all they ate in terms of meat was hamburgers and hot dogs. They're developing, recipes to feed families on a shoestring budget. Things like chipped beef on toast, known as SOS in the military. Other recipes like the garbage plate, which mixes a variety of foods together. Other things like mulligan stew, which mixes cheap cuts of meat and vegetables. Some of these recipes actually, even though they were developed out of poverty and out of struggle, they're still consumed today. They're still part of American regional cuisine, and you couldn't afford to waste a single thing. Leftover food, animal products like animal fat. You didn't want to throw those things away. You found a use for it. And believe it or not, even though so many Americans were struggling financially, people still would go to the movies. The movies were wildly popular in the 1930s, and I think it was because they were a form of escapism. You could get away from the privations of your daily life and worrying about money. You could have a little break for an hour and a half. Films like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, 1937, the first feature-length Disney animation movie, wildly popular. The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, also extremely popular as well. They came out in 1939. These are some of the highest grossing films of all time when you adjust for inflation and ticket prices. The average daily wage during the Depression was about $3.50 a day, and tickets cost about 25 cents. And people still wanted to go just to have a little bit of escapism. And all three of these movies are spectacular, even if the historicity of Gone with the Wind is certainly worth questioning. think about what that movie would have meant to people in the 1930s who were dealing with poverty. They're looking back at a very romantic, sentimental version of the American South, but challenges in the present will cause people to look back very nostalgically at the past. And also, The Wizard of Oz, the opening scenes are in black and white, but then when Dorothy reaches the land of Oz, it switches to Technicolor. And it would have been an excellent form of escapism to go from a gray, impoverished Kansas on screen to then the magical and colorful land of Oz. Here are some images related to fashion in the Great Depression. Um, Women's fashion got to be much more subdued and muted. Skirts were longer in the 30s than they were in the 20s. They're back well over the knees again. And this is a recession indicator, as I mentioned before. If people were going to wear brighter clothing, they often would wear dresses or blouses made out of flour sacks. And some flour companies, as you can see from the images on this slide, they began to sell their flour sacks in with these patterns to make it more desirable for consumers who could then use the sack to make some nicer clothing once they'd used all the flour. Here are some images related to food in the 1930s, recipes like mulligan stew, combining vegetables and cheap cuts of meat to make a inexpensive but wholesome meal for your family. SOS, or chipped beef on toast. Um, make do with what you have. Add vegetables and grains to meats to stretch them out. And many Americans also turn to charity, to bread lines and soup kitchens, which a lot of these services, especially those that were private charities, dependent on donations, they got overwhelmed during the Great Depression because there were just so many Americans who needed help, and people didn't have as much to give. So there's going to be more of a need for a government response to help the American people during the Great Depression. And hard times can make everyday people become very sentimental for the past, for an imagined nostalgic past, but they can also make people sympathize with, in some cases, with criminals, robbers, and gangsters, and people who are sticking it to the man and taking on the system. And you really see this with the public enemies of the Great Depression, people like Bonnie and Clyde and John Dillinger. These were robbers, gangsters who robbed banks, and in some cases, murdered people. But to many Americans, they became Robin Hood-style folk heroes for those that are down and out, who feel that they've been kicked around by the system, they've been taken advantage of by banks. They're the ones that are robbing banks. And really, Bonnie and Clyde especially, and I think to a lesser degree, Dillinger, they're kind of the 1930s version of the old Western outlaws like Jesse James and Billy the Kid, who many Americans in the 1870s and 1880s came to lionize those earlier outlaws. Remember also, this is the 1930s. The 1880s are only 50 years earlier. That's like us in the 2020s looking back on the 1970s. And Bonnie and Clyde, they were active in the American sort of heartland, Texas, Arkansas, parts of the South, and parts of the Great Plains. They committed robberies and they committed murders. And Dillinger operated more in the Midwest. And Bonnie and Clyde were eventually killed in an automobile shootout with the police in Louisiana. And Dillinger was shot by the FBI while he was coming out of a movie theater. As I said, movies were very popular in the 1930s, and they both were killed in 1934, and they all became martyrs in their own way. Thousands of people attended Bonnie and Clyde's funeral, for example. But when people are in dark economic times, they often will look to people that are taking on the system, even doing it in a criminal way. So now I want you to think about everything we've talked about so far in this video. Think about the extreme privations of the Great Depression. Massive unemployment, massive deflation, people not being able to pay their bills, losing their homes, even just struggling to eat. And think about how some Americans are turning to, they're really beginning to look up to, gangsters like Bonnie and Clyde and like John Dillinger. Think about all of these things, and also thinking about the Hoover administration and its numerous policy failures, especially things like the bonus army suppression in 1932. Um, so Hoover's running for re-election. He's a very embattled incumbent. He's going to lose to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democratic politician from New York. He had been governor of New York, and he'd also been assistant secretary of the Navy as well during the Wilson administration back in the 1910s. And it's a massive defeat for Hoover, as you can see. He gets less than 40% of the popular vote. Really, if you're losing less than 40% of the popular vote, you are moribund as a political candidate. You are dead in the water. And then it's a smashing defeat in the Electoral College as well. He loses every state except for Delaware, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. He even loses California, the state where he rose to prominence politically. And Hoover even lost voter blocks that generally were voted Republican. Farmers, they're going to shift significantly for FDR because they're struggling financially. And the farmers have been struggling since the 1920s. African Americans as well are also going to reject Hoover and not vote. In some parts of the country, they literally cannot vote. But African Americans who can vote either will protest and not vote for Hoover, or they might even cross the aisle and vote for FDR. Hoover had tried to reach out to African Americans previously in 1928, but worried that he was not doing well with white voters, he distanced himself from African Americans, and many African Americans saw this as a betrayal, and rightfully so. FDR's policies and his promises, campaign promises from FDR, even though he was a Democrat, they sounded good to African Americans who had been hit especially hard by the Great Depression. And, Roosevelt, he had good name recognition. He was from a powerful political family, the Roosevelts. He was a cousin of former President Teddy Roosevelt, and he was a part of the progressive movement. And his New Deal promise, which we're going to unpack in this video, is very reminiscent of the progressive era of a more active U.S. government that's much more involved in the economy and in society. FDR was also physically disabled. He had lost the use of his legs. Originally, people thought that he had polio, although nowadays some people think he actually had a disease called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which polio usually onsets when you're young, when you're a child, and it can cause you to lose the power to walk, the ability to walk. But Guillain-Barré syndrome, which FDR may have actually had, it onsets during adulthood because he lost the ability to walk as an adult. So he would actually have to hide the fact that he was disabled or differently abled. When he was in a wheelchair, he would wear a heavy cape. When he would walk with a cane, and he had braces on his legs. He could sort of hobble short distances, but they would try to not show him walking long distances. He would also lean on the arms of his Secret Service men, and he would lean on the podium and hold himself up, basically. He had a very strong upper body. He had to, that way he could balance himself and present this illusion that he could walk. And the press had what was called a gentleman's agreement with FDR and his campaign. They would not show his disability, and in exchange, they would have access to his campaign. And after he was president, this gentleman's agreement continued, although there is some evidence that Secret Service men might confiscate footage that showed FDR hobbling or showed him being pushed in a wheelchair. That footage can be found, but it's kind of rare. And the press overall was generally friendlier to FDR than they were to Hoover. They went along with this charade, we might call it. And I'm not insulting FDR because of this disability. I think it shows real strength and commitment that he overcame it. I'm just explaining the context. But it's a massive win for FDR. He wins traditionally Democratic strongholds like the Deep South and New York. But he also does really well out west with groups that often voted Republican, like farmers, and even with African Americans as well. This election is considered to be the end of the fourth party system and the beginning of the fifth party system. And the fifth party system is going to last until about 1980. And during his campaign, FDR, he promised that if he were elected, he would give Americans a new deal. It's card playing imagery. He's generally kind of evasive and vague about what the New Deal is, which is the smart thing to do. You don't want to be too specific in your campaign because then your opponent might start to pick apart your policies, or they might steal them and say that they're going to do it too. But he criticized Hoover's handling of the Depression. He criticized Hoover's deficit spending, and he advocated for his New Deal. One last thing I'll note is John Nance Garner was FDR's running mate for vice president. John Nance Garner was better known as Cactus Jack. He was a Texas uh, politician, really a white Southern Democrat, pro segregation and things like that, and also a very crass, very crude man. FDR was from an upper class family. He was very urbane, very proper in how he spoke. Not Garner. Garner, he was questioned about why he was the vice president or why he was chosen. He famously said, "Well, in the office of the vice president, it ain't worth a bucket of spit." Except he didn't say spit. He said a four-letter word for urine. But the press didn't want to repeat what he actually said. But that was the kind of guy that Garner was. And he was there to balance the ticket, a white Southern Democrat alongside the Northern Democrat who was a former progressive. I also want to touch a little bit on FDR's personal life. We don't have time to get too deep into his personal life. He was married to Eleanor Roosevelt, who was also his cousin. This was fairly common amongst upper class American families to uh, keep the wealth in the family. But this is an interesting picture of the two of them. It shows FDR holding knitting needles, something that his wife would have done. Knitting was associated with women and femininity. She is shown holding a champagne glass. It was well known that FDR liked to have a drink, and alcohol was seen as, again, being more of a male vice in this period in history. And this kind of gender bending photograph was pretty popular in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was a way of kind of questioning the gender norms of the day, but in a harmless and in a manner that's not going to get you in trouble. And it highlights the unconventional marriage that they had, this marriage of convenience between cousins. They're questioning the gender norms a bit as well. Um, there's also, FDR had extramarital affairs. It's believed that Eleanor had extramarital affairs, including possibly with a woman named Lorena Hickok, a photographer from the period. So they're in a very unconventional, you might almost call it a open marriage. And as far as religious beliefs go, FDR was an Episcopalian, although not a very devout Episcopalian. He believed in the social gospel, which was a progressive era idea that the church, Christianity, should be involved in social change more than in spiritual matters. And he would not be considered an evangelical or a fundamentalist Christian today by any means. FDR referred to himself as a Christian and a Democrat, suggesting that his political beliefs were every bit as important to him as his religious beliefs. I will say, though, that over time, FDR did become more religious, particularly by the period of World War II in which he was, praying publicly for the American war effort. But people often become more religious as they age, and of course, warfare, the stress of warfare will lead people to become more spiritual as well. People have also talked about FDR's intellect, his intelligence. I don't think that FDR was the egg-headed intellectual that other U.S. presidents were, like Thomas Jefferson or Woodrow Wilson, the college professor president, or even Teddy Roosevelt, his cousin, who was a renowned and published author. FDR was a smart guy. He went to Ivy League universities. He'd been a newspaper editor for college newspapers. But people at the time said that he had a first-rate temperament and a second-rate intellect. That he wasn't a massive bookworm, but he could really read people, and he knew what to say to them to make them feel better, and he knew how to motivate them to do what he wanted. He had what we would call in modern language high emotional intelligence. That's really going to serve him well. In his inaugural address, he assured the American people, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And that was how he spoke. He spoke with that very urbane, very proper, upper class, transatlantic or mid-Atlantic accent. You're going to see in his style, he was a master of public relations and of portraying himself in a way that would make the American people trust him and support him. Once he becomes president after the 32 election, FDR makes the contents of the New Deal much clearer. He's going to call for really sweeping legislation, and he's able to do this because the Democratic Party, they gain the majority in Congress. So he's able to act almost with carte blanche for the first 4 or 5 years of his presidency, even after his reelection in 1936. And one of the first things that FDR wanted to see changed was he wanted to see prohibition brought to an end, bring about an end to the 18th Amendment to the Volstead Act, replace it with the 21st Amendment, which will cancel out the Volstead Act and make alcohol legal nationwide again. Alcoholic beverages, the taxes on them, the extra business they would bring to restaurants and taverns and bars, it would be good for the economy. It would put people back to work. And making alcohol legal again is also going to deny organized crime syndicates a major part of their business. The slogan for FDR's campaign and afterward was beer before Easter. It ended up taking a little bit longer. It was actually more like beer before Christmas in 1933. And after the repeal of the 18th Amendment, FDR famously said, what this country needs is a stiff drink. And remember, FDR liked to consume alcohol. He also liked to use tobacco. He liked to smoke as well. Other legislation that comes out shortly after FDR becomes president is the National Firearms Act of 1934, which requires certain weapons, including automatics like the Thompson submachine gun, they're going to have to be taxed and recorded in a national registry. And this tax was quite expensive. It was a few $100s. It'd be about a few $1,000s in today's money. And it's designed to make it more difficult to get firearms. It's supposed to cut down on organized crime. Things like the 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Also, FDR himself had survived a assassination attempt when he was president-elect while he was touring Miami, Florida. Italian immigrant anarcho-communist named Giuseppe Zangara attempted to assassinate the president as well. So there's a reason that they're pushing for this type of gun control, which there had been attempts at gun control before the 1934 NFA, but it was usually done on a state and local level. In some cases, it was done out of xenophobic concerns or even out of racist concerns, an attempt to keep immigrants from having guns, to keep African Americans from having guns or Native Americans from having guns. But again, gun control is a controversial issue. People debate the Second Amendment and what gun control is constitutional, if any. I'll leave that to you all to decide what is appropriate and what is not. And here are some images of people advocating for an end to prohibition. As you can see from the newspaper headline, prohibition does finally end in December of 1933. Notice the NRA Blue Eagle sticker at the top of the newspaper. It's not the National Rifle Association, NRA, it's the National Recovery Admin. It was an organization, it was a New Deal program. And of course, the 18th Amendment was overridden by the 21st Amendment, which ended national prohibition. And here you see a group of women carrying signs saying they want prohibition to end. Remember, in many cases, prohibition was pushed by women's activist movements, feminist movements. They were concerned that men were drinking too much alcohol, but now women are seeking to bring an end to this prohibition of alcohol. And here are Thompson submachine guns, which would be regulated under the NFA. Some of the different varieties of machine guns that were used. The Thompson was actually developed. It was supposed to be used in World War I, but it wasn't finished in time. But it was used by organized crime groups in the 1920s, especially the 1921 and 1928 models. And this is also an image of Giuseppe Zangara, the Italian immigrant that tried to assassinate President-elect FDR. Zangara was an anarcho-communist. So what was the New Deal? It's FDR's greatest political accomplishment, besides his leadership of the United States during World War II. The New Deal was a series of public works projects, regulations, business regulations, financial reforms, new laws to protect workers' rights, and even government agencies and bureaus that were designed to get Americans back to work, rebuild the economy, and prevent future depressions. And the New Deal is also going to fundamentally change the relationship that American citizens will have with their government. And it's doing this, though, in a way that the progressive era reformers would have supported. The progressives at the turn of the century, they believed that government power should be used to fix social problems. It should regulate capitalism, buff out its rough edges, and basically create a mixed economy where you have capitalist free enterprise, but you have some government regulation and some central management that you see more like in a socialist system. What we have in America is a mixed economy. And then within this mixed economy, there's a debate about what role government should play specifically and what role business and corporations should specifically play in this system. It's the degree of regulation that is debated. And the New Dealers in FDR's cabinet, the brain trust is what they were called, because there were a lot of intellectuals and academics that talked with FDR. FDR may not have been an intellectual or an academic himself, but he palled around a lot with academic type people who would help him create his policies and justify them. So the idea is you're going to fix the economy and prevent similar crashes. The New Deal is said to be based around the three R's. I say said to be based around the three R's because this is how the New Deal policies have been defined and how they've been categorized. I think with FDR and his cabinet, they were doing a lot more making it up as you go type of things, figuring things out as they went along. So the three R's are: 1, relief for the unemployed and the poor; 2, recovery of the economy, more short-term goals; and then 3, reform and regulation. More long-term solutions to redefine America's political and financial systems and to make future depressions not as likely or not as severe. And so you create new bureaus, new government organizations, you pass new legislation, and a lot of these laws and organizations are shortened to acronyms. Here are a few examples. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Acts of 1933 and 1938. These were farm aid policies. It's why farmers will vote for FDR. They want farm assistance. I'll go over what some of that stuff is later. The CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps, of 1933. They did conservation work in national parks, getting young men in particular back to work. The FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance, 1933. The FDIC insures bank deposits of up to $250,000. It's still in effect today. The FERA, or FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. It was another organization that put blue-collar workers especially back to work. The FSA, the Farm Security Administration, it's a later policy from 1937. It helped farmers keep their land and not lose their farms. The SSA, or the Social Security Administration, of 1935. Social Security is still in effect today. It's quite a bit different now than it used to be, though, as you're going to see later. The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is still around today, they were started in 1933. And then the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration. It was started in 1935. It actually replaced FERA, or FERA. And we'll talk about what the WPA is later. There's often, in discussions of the New Deal, there's what are called the phases of the New Deal. And the first New Deal is from 1933 to 1934. This is right after FDR is elected. He does have a majority in Congress. They're able to get a lot of legislation passed. It's considered a pretty productive period in FDR's presidency and in the New Deal era. The second New Deal is from 1935 to 1938. This is after the midterm elections in which the Democrats do well. FDR is able to continue his policies, and then during the second New Deal, FDR wins his reelection, which makes him in some ways bolder, and it leads to some bigger, more sweeping New Deal changes. Generally, the second New Deal is seen as being the biggest and most expansive of these New Deal phases. And then there's what is often called the third New Deal, and some scholars say there really isn't a third New Deal, but I think there is. There still is some interesting legislation that's happening in 1939 to 1941. And FDR is still president and still doing important things. And this is the third New Deal where FDR is more focused on consolidating other earlier New Deal gains and also getting America ready for World War II. So 3 New Deals, first and second are when the most stuff happens. The third it's debatable whether it should even really be considered a phase, but I do think it's important. And the New Deal was controversial. Not everybody supported it. There were many Republicans who opposed it because they were FDR's political opponent. Herbert Hoover opposed the New Deal, even though in some ways the New Deal was basically just a bigger, more national version of what he was doing. But he felt that this was unconstitutional. It was being done by his political opponent. But even some more conservative and more limited government Democrats opposed the New Deal. John Davis of West Virginia, who had run for president in 1924, was one of the most vocal critics of the New Deal, as was Al Smith of New York, the 1928 Democratic nominee for president who lost to Hoover. Smith was not as conservative, but he was more of a libertarian, limited government type of politician. Here are some images and cartoons related to the New Deal. On the top left, you see children playing Ring Around the Rosie. The children represent various New Deal programs. You see a second New Deal program like the WPA, a first New Deal program like the AAA. Here is the New Deal as a card playing image. Protection of gold. We'll get to that later. Bank holidays. Bank holidays were times when banks would be shut down, and during bank holidays, you couldn't go to the bank and withdraw your money. These were done to keep Americans who were nervous about losing their money from taking their money out of the bank and then the bank failing, because banks loan out money, they have leverage, they over leverage, and not everybody's going to be able to get their money back. So people lose their money and the bank shuts down. But bank holidays make those shutdowns more difficult because people can't withdraw their money. And you hear about them a lot, like in Britain, for example, but FDR used bank holidays to protect American banks, to keep them from failing, and really to protect everyday Americans' money as well. But this was a very nerve-wracking thing for everyday Americans. There are no credit cards or debit cards back then. If you have no money and your bank is shut down, you could be in trouble. And he tried to assure the American people that everything was going to be okay. He gave messages over the radio called fireside chats. And the idea was he spoke in a very calm, reassuring voice. And it really sounded like he was there in your parlor, sitting next to you by the fire, telling you about what he was going to be doing as president. And one of the first ones he gave was about bank holidays, in which he told everybody that, I know this is an inconvenience, but it's for the good of the country, and it's to protect your deposits. But eventually the FDIC is going to be created to ensure, the government is going to ensure bank deposits. On a more negative side, he did have critics. People said that he was growing his own power, the power of the executive branch. Here he's a giant Oliver Twist asking for more power, more pleas, whereas he's overriding Congress, who's powerless to stop him. In this last image here, it shows FDR as a doctor. Sometimes he referred to the New Deal as Dr. New Deal and as remedies, which this is a throwback to the progressive era. The progressives really like to refer to their policies as medicine to fix social diseases, to heal social diseases. So here we see Dr. President FDR. Of course, we may have to change remedies if we don't get the results. Again, he's a very flexible man when it comes to principles, and He's going to, if something's not working, he'll try something different. In Congress, here is a dutiful nursemaid. Now, as time goes on, FDR does get more resistance from Congress as the political situation changes. But here, Uncle Sam is ill, sitting in his chair, and there are a whole a whole litany of medicines for him to take. The CCC, which we're going to talk about, the NRA, which I've alluded to before, and we'll discuss some of these programs in future slides. This is Al Smith. He was a former Democratic nominee for president, and he was one of the most significant critics that FDR had within the Democratic Party, within his own party. Smith famously said that the nation was drowning in alphabet soup under the New Deal. Here's Al looking in on the president as he's stirring up a big bowl of alphabet soup, or a big pot of alphabet soup. By the way, alphabet soup had already been around for a very long time. In my research, I've found that it began to be consumed in America around the turn of the century, and it may have been invented actually in France as early as the 1870s. But I think this is a miscalculation on Smith's part. His attempt to ridicule the New Deal, actually, I think it made Americans like it more, because so many Americans are, struggling to afford food. They're standing in bread lines, alphabet soup. That sounds really good if you've been standing in a bread line all day, if your family has nothing to eat. So it was an attempt to criticize the New Deal, but I think it actually backfired. Now we'll talk about the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, and it's one of my favorite New Deal programs. They were young men who did work in national parks across the country. It was billed as an opportunity to get a good job, live an active, healthy lifestyle, learn important skills that you could use in the workforce, and make money and have your clothing and have your lodging provided for. And FDR assured people that there was not going to be any military training involved, but there would be sort of you might almost call it a paramilitary camaraderie that's going to develop amongst the CCC enrollees. And this is a image on this slide of a poster for the CCC, and then of CCC workers at a camp in Pennsylvania. And there were projects done throughout the country. And FDR even visited CCC camps and spent time with the CCC recruits. He famously said they've been working so hard and eating so well, they're putting on 10 to 12 pounds of muscle, and here I am, I need to lose about 10 to 12 pounds. So the CCC is a first New Deal project. It begins in 1933, and it is a quasi-military organization. Members of the CCC have certain discipline standards they have to follow. They wear uniforms, they march to work, they carry their shovels as if they're carrying rifles, and this actually, I think, is a good thing. It promotes camaraderie and discipline amongst the ranks. It helps young men of a variety of backgrounds work together and get to know each other. And as time goes on, the depression gets worse. Unemployment reaches 25%. Many families had no choice but to kick out their oldest son. Their oldest sons would become homeless. They'd become what were called hobos or tramps. Sometimes they would ride on trains, and there were reports they would get into trouble. And there was particularly a fear of young, homeless, black teenagers. And the idea is get these young men, including minority men, get them off the streets and get them to work in these CCC camps. They're going to do important work for the country. They're going to be kept an eye on. They're going to get job training. They're going to do important work. They're also going to play on sports teams. They're going to get to go to classes and things like that. And they're going to receive $30 a month, or about $1 a day. Another day, another dollar, as they used to say. It's about $600 a month in the present. So this was considered to be a good wage, though, during the Great Depression. Because remember, these young men, their room and board is taken care of. And most of the money, though, is not given to the actual CCC workers. Typically, the majority of their monthly paycheck was sent home to their families because their families had hungry mouths to feed. Their families may even have grandparents living at home, or their fathers may be out of work. And so from 1933 to 1942, when it was finally shut down, the CCC is going to set up camps across the country, and its workers are going to engage in a variety of projects, especially infrastructure and conservation projects in national parks. They're going to be doing environmental conservation work, but also building cabins and building trails and things of that nature so that people can more easily use the national parks. And it's not a military organization, but you do wear uniforms, you do live in camps, you do march to work, and there's certain regulations you have to follow. And their managers were often members of the U.S. National Guard. And military officers like George C. Marshall and Douglas MacArthur, especially MacArthur, who really did not like FDR very much and who was very critical of FDR's policies, he liked the CCC. He saw it as a organization that could prepare young men for a future conflict, for a future war. Typically, the enrollees were unmarried men, ages 18 to 25. You would serve for at least 6 months, but you could not serve for more than 2 years, typically. And the CCC hired men of all races, African Americans and Native Americans as well. As I mentioned, many minority groups had very higher unemployment rates than white Americans, so they really benefited from this program. For example, about half of the households of the South Dakota Sioux, they had a CCC enrollee that was sending money home. And while this group, the CCC, did projects where black men and white men and Native American men might possibly work together, the actual units were segregated, the barracks were segregated. You might work together, but then you'd go back to your separate barracks. And proponents of the CCC said that it was a good organization. It offered job training. It offered homes for young men who maybe wouldn't have had a home otherwise. Their families were supported as well. And the training that they got was almost like paramilitary training. It taught discipline. But detractors of the program, they would have said the program was too strict. Its militaristic regulations were inappropriate for a civilian organization. And others would say that the work was too much, there was too much focus on work in national parks, and that there were other infrastructure projects in cities that needed to be done. And still others would say that the organization should not have been segregated. Black men and white men should have been able to be in the same barracks together. So there's always critiques and criticisms of these New Deal programs. And in 1939, the CCC doesn't go away, but it begins to transition away from conservation work and towards military infrastructure work to get America ready for World War II. And by 1942, the organization is shut down. Here are some images related to CCC projects. CCC workers, they did projects across the United States in national parks. They planted trees, they cut down trees, they did flood control projects, they built infrastructure like trails and cabins, and people were encouraged to join this organization, not just for the money, but for the job training and for the camaraderie, for the physical activity. This is how it's sold to young American men. Here are some more images related to CCC projects. As I said, there were African Americans and Native Americans that joined the CCC. The organization, while it was multiracial, it was men only. And the idea was these communities had been hit especially hard by the Depression. They'd been dealing with poverty well before the 1930s. And there was a fear of young homeless men, especially young homeless black men. And I'm going to give an example of what I mean there soon. But again, rebuilding forests, replanting forests, doing all kinds of flood control and environmental mitigation work, and then infrastructure for the national parks as well were just a few of the things that CCC workers were doing during this period. I'm going to take a quick break from talking about the CCC and mention something called the Scottsboro case. As I said, there was a fear of young homeless men going around on trains as hobos. We wouldn't consider that to be an appropriate term today, but that was the term they would have used back then. And in 1931, a group of young black male teenagers, They had an altercation with some white homeless teenagers that were on a train. This train was passing through southern Tennessee and northern Alabama, and there were two young white women who claimed that they had been sexually assaulted by the black teenagers. The young black men were arrested. They were put on trial in Alabama. There were no black jury members because black people had been disenfranchised and they were off the jury rolls. They did not receive proper counsel, and they were convicted and sentenced to death by an all-white jury. They will appeal the verdict, and they're going to get a better lawyer, a guy named Saul Leibowitz he was from the Northeast, from New York, and his fees were paid by the Communist Party of the USA. Leibowitz himself was not a communist, but that group, that organization, was supporting the Scottsboro Boys in this trial, where they were accused of a crime that really the evidence that they did it was spurious at best. And additional evidence came to light that the teenage girls were lying, not telling the truth, and that these young men had not been guilty of the crime that they were accused of having committed. And also, the young women that claimed they'd been sexually assaulted, it was found that they were involved in sex work or prostitution. And while that would be controversial today, it would have been much more controversial in the 1930s. So there were reasons at the time to not believe their testimony. And appeals were made to the Supreme Court in 1935, and the Supreme Court declared that the defendants had not received a fair trial because of Alabama's racist jury selection laws, amongst many other issues. In the end, the defendants received life sentences instead of the death penalty, and most were eventually paroled and pardoned. But again, these were young men who spent many years in prison for crimes they did not commit. Justice delayed is justice denied. And it was considered to be an example of racism in the Jim Crow system in the South, and an example of the miscarriage of justice. But it did set judicial precedent, and it led to some landmark case law, including calls to include African Americans in jury selection. Even if African Americans could not vote, there were plans to make sure that African Americans could still serve on juries. That way, juries could be racially integrated. They'd be more likely to decide in an unprejudiced manner in the event that a black person was the defendant. And on a pop cultural level, the case was seen as representation of racism in particularly Southern American society. It inspired songs and poems, most notably a blues singer, a black blues singer known as Leadbelly. He did a spoken word poem in one of his records in which he urged his listeners to stay woke, to watch out for potential violence from whites. And that's the origin of the term woke, although many would argue that it actually means something else today. It means something much broader today, but I'm not commenting on contemporary politics or on contemporary culture war issues. And this is definitely a case you should know about for the Florida Civic Literacy exam. I'm going to touch on one more important aspect of the CCC, and that is the CCC and the environment. In the 1930s, Americans had become more concerned about environmental conservation. Americans had been concerned about environmental conservation even before the 1930s. Teddy Roosevelt was concerned about it. National parks were established long before the 1930s, but there was an environmental disaster called the Dust Bowl that affected Middle America from about 1930, really until about 1940. But the worst years for the Dust Bowl were from about 1934 to 1936. A huge ecological disaster in which topsoil from the American prairie states and western states got blown away in the wind and left basically deserts where you couldn't grow anything. This dust blew in the air all the way to the East Coast, devastating for American agriculture and really bad for anyone living in the region. These dust storms could be deadly. People could die from breathing in this dusty air. They could have their livestock killed. They could have their fields destroyed. The Dust Bowl disaster it began largely because of over farming in this region, in the Great Plains region. You might even link this to the homestead farming system was very damaging to the Great Plains. People were farming too much of the prairie grasses. This makes erosion much more likely. They were using too much water to irrigate their crops via crop irrigation, and basically this environmental disaster was created by agricultural techniques and policies. But either way, it was devastating for Americans living in Oklahoma, Kansas, parts of Texas especially. Farmers will leave this region. They're called Okies because of Oklahoma. And they're going to leave the Midwest and leave the Great Plains. They're going to go to places like California, where they're going to work as migrant workers, picking fruit and vegetables, being paid very low wages, and often being treated very badly by the people in California. You can learn more about their story by reading John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath. It's um, fictional characters, but it's telling a story about real events. It's a great read. It's a very depressing read, and it has some very graphic content, but I definitely recommend reading The Grapes of Wrath. And the CCC is working to prevent future ecological disasters like the Dust Bowl. A lot of the tree planting projects, flood control projects, these are designed to protect American topsoil and protect America's agricultural resources to prevent future events like the Dust Bowl. Here are some images related to the Dust Bowl. Here is a Oklahoma or Okie family. They're in California picking cotton in 1936. The Okies would sell their land. They would sell what livestock they had. They would buy beat up old jalopy cars, and they would load up and go to California and live there in great poverty. Many suggest that not only was it farming practices that caused the Dust Bowl, but the shift away from horse-drawn plows towards tractor plows also accelerated the Dust Bowl. But you can see images here from 1934, dust clouds reaching all the way to the East Coast in New York City, Oklahoma in 1935, and then what was called Black Sunday in Texas because the skies became black with the dust of American topsoil and people's farming fortunes blowing away. So this is the Dust Bowl. The CCC was also created to try to mitigate environmental disasters like this. Speaking of the Dust Bowl, I want to talk about the New Deal in American agriculture because farmers had been more likely to be Republican voters in this period if they're not living in the South. But they're going to vote for the Democrats because of these agricultural policies. So remember, from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, American farmers on their homesteads, they're really struggling with low grain prices, strong competition. Some will try to grow more, that way they can keep up. And that in some ways enables the Dust Bowl that happens in the 30s. And as time goes on, there's less arable land available. And then a lot of the arable land is being destroyed in the Dust Bowl. Technological innovation and disruption, a common theme in this course. It's transformed America from a rural agrarian republic into an urban industrial state. Farmers and farming interests are no longer driving the majority of American policy decisions. This is something that happens in the late 1890s, but there are concerns. Farmers are still an important group. They feed the country and they feed the world. And the FDR and the New Deal supporters recognize this. And a lot of the policies that agrarian populists, back in the 1880s and 1890s, things that they wanted, farm subsidies, looser monetary policies, inflationist policies to help farmers get out of debt, income taxes, and things like that, they're going to be achieved as part of the New Deal. Income taxes have been around before the New Deal, but they're going to be increased during the New Deal. And so you're also going to see things like the 1933 AAA farm subsidies. These would include farm subsidies for things like corn, hogs, and milk. More problematically, tobacco, which isn't really a food item and it's addictive and not good for you, but they got subsidies as well. Basically, these farmers are being paid to not produce these goods. That's going to increase commodity prices. It's going to lead to the land not being as overworked, and it's going to help farmers live a better life because they have more money and they're growing less and they can sell what they do grow for higher prices. Of course, there are criticisms with these policies, which I'm going to get over as well. There are other New Deal era farm programs as well, like the Resettlement Authority and the Farm Security Administration, or FSA. The Resettlement Authority would help displaced farm workers, not landowning farmers. It would help them find new jobs elsewhere. And the Resettlement Authority was really made in many ways with African American sharecroppers in mind to help them not be displaced from the land and be able to work in the agricultural industry. The FSA, or the Farm Security Administration, was more designed for landowning farmers who were overwhelmingly white to help them not lose their land. And groups like the Okies, groups like Southern sharecroppers, they could have benefited from these Resettlement Authority and Farm Security Administration plans. Of course, many others were not able to take advantage of them, and they had to go to California to find work. There are, of course, criticisms with these agricultural policies, as there are with every New Deal policy. The subsidies are much more attainable for larger farms. Some would argue that the fact that these subsidies are hard to get, you have to qualify for them and things like that. It's going to lead to big consolidation. Farms, small family farms, getting bought up into what we often call agribusiness. They're going to be the ones who are going to be able to claim these subsidies far better than small farmers. There also is concern about waste of food and livestock. If you do overproduce, that food cannot be sold and used. And there are people in America who are starving. In the Grapes of Wrath, farmers in California, if they have excess oranges, they can't just give those to the Okies. They cover them on gasoline and light them on fire. That way they're not overproducing. But that means the Okies who need food, they can't just have those oranges for themselves. So there are criticisms of these subsidies. Also, there's subsidies on hogs as well. So if you raise too many pigs, you're going to have to cull the extra pigs that you have, which is an animal rights issue because those animals are dying for nothing. Also, sometimes farmers don't do what they're supposed to. They double plant. They basically secretly grow more than they're supposed to, and they sell on the sly. So again, there's often criticisms for these programs. And one thing that sometimes food historians argue is that these subsidies, which were originally for things like corn and hogs and dairy products, they redefine the American diet and lead to people eating a lot more meat and dairy and grains and less fruits and vegetables. And that the subsidies basically made the American diet more unhealthy. And there might be some truth to that. As a food historian who works on that subject, I think there is some truth to that. And then the last thing I'll point out, and I mentioned this before, is that these programs were made more with white farmers in mind than they were black agricultural workers who may not own actual farmland. They work in the agricultural industry, but they're not landowning farmers. Now I'm going to talk about another very important New Deal work program known as the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration. It was set up in 1935, which is at the beginning of the second New Deal. This is after the midterm elections in 1934. And the WPA replaced the FERA, or FERA. It's a work program. FERA was more for blue-collar workers. WPA is much more all-encompassing. There was work for blue-collar workers and for white-collar workers. It has a similar goal as well to the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, provide work for unemployed people. And it ends in 1943 during World War II because there were plenty of other wartime jobs available. So the WPA, unlike the CCC, which was a male-only, young male organization for men only, the WPA employs white-collar workers as well as blue-collar workers and professionals, and it employs both men and women. They employed a lot of teachers and artists and clerical workers who had lost their jobs, in addition to blue-collar workers. And they do a variety of work, and they employ women too, something the CCC did not do. Some of the projects they do are infrastructure projects. There's job training that's offered. They also do a lot of cultural projects as well. They paint murals. They do art projects. Richard Nixon, who was an artist, and from a poor family, did work with the CCC, excuse me, the WPA. Um, One of my favorite WPA projects was the WPA Slave Narratives Project, in which they interviewed former enslaved people, who many of whom were passing away by the 1930s. The WPA workers, they traveled across the South. They interviewed former enslaved people, recording their stories. The WPA also interviewed older white people as well, like in the Pioneer Narratives Project, about what the American frontier was like. But they ask former slaves in the Slave Narratives Project, what was life like as a slave, and what was life like during the Civil War and Reconstruction. And the interviewers would record the informants' responses and then transcribe them. You can listen to the recordings, and you can read the transcriptions as well. And it's one of the first and really most important oral history projects ever completed. And it's an essential source of information for anybody who wants to study African American history or history of slavery. They're referenced in many works in those fields. Um, there are criticisms of the WPA. People argued that these WPA projects, that they were unnecessary, that they were luxury projects, art projects and things like that. These slave narratives, while interesting, they're not essential for the country. Others argue that the projects don't really benefit the working class. They benefit more upper class people, these art projects and things like that. And some argue that these government workers, they don't work efficiently. Because they're government workers, it's harder to be removed from your job. You can take a nap on the job. There was even a Louis Armstrong song from 1940 called the WPA that mocked the WPA workers for being inefficient. Here are a couple of images related to the WPA. It was jobs for both men and women. They offered all kinds of job training. Um, Some of the jobs that they offered training in were jobs that could be done by both men and by women, but there was a gendered element to the WPA. They would train men to be construction workers and engineers and mechanics, but they would train women to be secretaries and clerks and cooks and nurses and domestic workers. They did train women in some jobs that could be done by men, like teaching, for example. But it is sort of a gendered organization. They're not looking to break gender norms in the period. They're looking to get people back to work and to get work projects done. And one of the most notable projects was the WPA Slave Narratives Project, which I think is a really interesting project as a historian. It's something I've used quite a bit. I've done research on these narratives. There are some criticisms even of how these narratives are done, because what you find is many African Americans, elderly African Americans, speak very nostalgically about the antebellum slavery South. Um, in some ways, this is because these are elderly people, and people always remember the past nostalgically as being much better than it actually was. And many African Americans were really struggling in the Great Depression, and they were struggling with the Jim Crow laws. So they're in a difficult present that's going to make the past seem better by comparison. Additionally, the interviewers also have an impact. We found that in areas where the interviewers were more likely to be white, like in South Carolina, African Americans tend to give much more positive reports about what life was like as a slave. Whereas in other parts of the South, like in Virginia, where there were a larger number of black interviewers interviewing black former slaves, the former slaves are much more likely to give very negative testimonies about the difficulties and violence of slavery. So there may have been bias in the interviewers. There may have been real fear on the part of African American former slaves that they might be punished for saying the wrong thing in these WPA narratives. But I'm still glad that the narratives were done. They've been very useful to me in my work, and they have been for many historians. This map shows where WPA projects are done. Each WPA project is denoted by a little dot on this map. And you'll notice that the majority of these projects are done in the Northeast and in large urban centers. There are projects in rural areas as well, but you're definitely going to see a lot of the projects in the Northeast and the Midwest, and some in like more urban parts of California, for example. There's not so many in the American West or in the Great Plains. that's more where the CCC is going to be operating, although the CCC was also a national organization too. This is the WPA clock tower in Bandshell in Daytona Beach, Florida. It's right on the boardwalk of the beach. You can see it right from the water. Um, my mother used to go to the beach right at this spot, but it's really interesting the work they've done. They're using local coquina stone, but you can see how detractors of the WPA would say, is this really the most necessary thing? A band shell? There's people that are living in Hoovervilles that are out of work. Maybe we should be building other things, not a band shell that's going to be for upper class people to go watch performances and things like that. So still, though, I wanted to give an example of a local WPA project, and I'm using the band shell and the WPA clock tower here in Daytona Beach, Florida, about an hour and a half north of where I live. I'm now going to talk about some changes to the American financial and monetary system that come out as a result of the New Deal. I'll talk a bit about the FDIC in a little bit more detail, and I'll talk about the Gold Reserve Act, or gold preservation as it was referred to by the president and his supporters. And I'm going to talk about the Social Security Administration as well, but I'm going to get to Social Security a little bit later in the video. I'm going to talk about the FDIC and gold reserve and some other legislation first. Remember, the New Deal is divided into three phases, and it's also divided into the three phases of relief, recovery, and reform. It's doing more than just immediate relief of putting people back to work. It's about changing the American monetary system, reform to make depressions like this less likely in the future. And so FDR and his coalition of supporters and his cabinet and within Congress, they're going to create the FDIC, or Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, in 1933. It's a first New Deal project. The FDIC certified that banks be backed by the federal government to prevent them from overextending themselves, because banks extend out way more than what funds they have. That's how they make money. But that's, of course, risky. And if people go to the bank to withdraw their funds, there could be a run on the bank. And then if you don't get there in time, you lose your money and the bank fails. So Americans would do this basically every time there was a large financial crisis since the 1800s. So the FDIC insures deposits of up to $250,000. Is to prevent future runs on banks. There's also something called the Glass-Steagall Act, or the GSA, another 1933 First New Deal policy, and it regulates the kind of investments that commercial banks can make. It's to keep them from making risky investments that are done more by investment banks. It's, again, to protect the client's money. The Glass-Steagall Act, unlike the FDIC, it's no longer in effect. It was repealed in 1999 during the Clinton presidency. But really, scholars would say that the GSA was basically ignored since the 1960s. There were some pretty big changes to the American monetary system in the 1960s as well. FDR is also going to help to bring about the end to the gold standard with what is called the Gold Reserve Act of 1933 to 1934. Basically, this was an executive order that said that Americans had to turn in any gold coins they had, gold specie, and this was done to build up America's gold supply and to end the dollar's convertibility to gold, because in the past, other nations would trade in their dollars for gold, and basically they were depleting America's gold supply. This happened in the 1890s, and J.P. Morgan had to basically bail out the U.S. Banking system. So this is done to prevent that sort of thing from happening in the future, to keep America from defaulting. But also it allows for more inflation, and it allows for more government spending, because we're not on a tight gold-backed currency anymore. We're still backed by silver, and that's going to change as well. But for now, this is the beginning of the end of the gold standard in America. The SEC is also created as well in 1934. This is towards the end of the first New Deal. The Securities and Exchange Commission, not the football conference. And this, again, It regulates the kind of investments that people can make in America to make the economy more stable and less volatile and mercurial. And FDR also supported revenue acts in 1935 and 1937. These were tax increases of up to 75% on the wealthiest Americans, very, very high tax percentages, much higher than today. And the thing is, of course, there's always tax loopholes, there's carve-outs, there's ways that you can get around paying those taxes. Wealthy people who are going to help write these laws via their lobbyists and via campaign contributions. So you're not everybody's paying, not every wealthy person is paying 75% of their income. There's always ways to get around this. These revenue acts were passed to keep the more left-wing elements in the New Deal coalition. People who were saying that FDR was not left-wing enough, he was not revolutionary enough. These tax increases, or they were called soak-the-rich taxes, they were designed really to mollify those more left-wing groups of people. You might say it was envy-based taxation as opposed to revenue-based taxation. The thing is, though, it may have satisfied some of the more left-leaning people in FDR's coalition, but some of the more right-leaning people that supported FDR, like chambers of commerce, for example, they will not support him in the 1930 in later elections because of these taxes. They start to see FDR as being a bit too anti-business. So this is a topic that's related to FDR's changes to the monetary system, specifically his changes to the gold standard via the Gold Reserve Act. There were Wall Street businessmen who were very concerned about these changes, that it would hurt their investments, and they actually planned a coup against FDR in 1933. They planned to take this guy, General Smedley Butler of the United States Marine Corps. They were going to make him the puppet president or puppet dictator of America, and basically it was going to be a fascist-style government that was going to be ruled by corporations via a puppet president. Butler himself was a well-known military veteran, well-known Marine veteran. His politics were definitely not what the business leaders was. Butler, in many ways, was almost a socialist, and he also was a prohibitionist as well, which is really interesting to see. He was a prohibitionist even in the 1930s, even when prohibition was no longer a popular policy. But the idea was he was going to be their puppet leader. The thing was, Butler ideologically did not align with the business leaders, and he reported that they had approached him about this coup. There was an investigation in Congress. There was coverage by the New York Times. We're not entirely sure how far along they were in their attempted coup, if they were just in the planning and talking stage. But there's very good evidence that they were planning to overthrow the U.S. government because they didn't like FDR's policies, specifically the Gold Reserve Act. And one other area of difference was Butler liked prohibition, FDR did not. And eventually, Butler, who was supportive of FDR, eventually he actually will turn on FDR because he doesn't think that FDR is left-wing enough. So we've talked about FDR and work programs like the CCC and the WPA, agricultural policy and monetary policy. I want to talk about American infrastructure as well, specifically the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is a first New Deal program that actually is still in effect today. The Tennessee Valley Authority and really the New Deal policymakers, they wanted to modernize and integrate rural America, especially parts of the South, because the majority of American homes in the rural areas did not have indoor plumbing. Many of them did not have electricity. Electrification spread to rural areas much more slowly than it did to urban areas. And providing inexpensive electricity via hydroelectric power could electrify rural areas. And the Tennessee Valley Authority was going to do that by building dams in the upper South. And they're also going to build these dams because the dams will prevent future floods, because there were some really, really horrific floods in this region of the country in the 1920s. It's flood control, it's electrification, bringing electricity to places that don't have it, or lowering people's electric bills. Electric bills, from what I've seen, were much more expensive in the 1930s than today. Um, a family could expect to spend $100 a month on average for a house's electric bill in parts of the South. Keep in mind that people don't have air conditioning, they often don't have electric refrigerators. $100 a month in 1930s money would be well over $1,000 a month in terms of today's dollars. Very, very unaffordable for many people. So there's a need for these programs for people to have electricity and then to have it for a lot less money. But the TVA will work on projects as far south as Jackson, Mississippi, and as far north as Bowling Green, Kentucky, in the Tennessee Valley watershed area. Um, there are, of course, detractors. People suggest that this is a government-run utility program. Should the government really have this kind of power over an essential and very important utility like electricity? And some will also point to the negative environmental impact of hydroelectric dams. They alter the flow of rivers. This can be bad for animal species, especially fish that migrate up and down rivers. And when these reservoirs are created behind dams, that means that both humans and animals are often displaced from their homes. So there's downsides to these big environmental projects as well. And the TVA is still around today, and the location of power plants and things like that has been a significant issue in recent years. Here are some images of hydroelectric dams. As I said, these dams, they create reservoirs behind them, which they can be used for boating, for fishing, and things like that. But if your farm or your land is going to be where this reservoir dam is going to be, you could lose your land. You may not be paid full price for it, via eminent domain. Animals, certainly their migration patterns are altered by the creation of these dams. There's issues with water temperature that come up as well when you create these dams and reservoirs. There's upsides and there's downsides to this hydroelectric system. It may be a renewable source of power, but it's not necessarily green power. Um, and people were more concerned about the environment in the 1930s than they had been in previous decades, but they didn't have the kind of concern about the environment that we do today. But there are, overall, I think there were benefits. I do think that the TVA was a net positive as it prevented severe floods and it did bring electricity to large parts of the country where it was either unaffordable or not available. And this area in green here is where Tennessee Valley projects were being built in the area of the country that it was trying to help. This was a very flood prone and economically impoverished part of the United States. Now we'll talk about human power. We'll talk about labor during the New Deal. And we'll start by talking about the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. This is the NRA Blue Eagle Seal. If you displayed the Blue Eagle Seal, it was because you were a member of the NRA, and there were certain benefits that came if you were an NRA member. Basically, the U.S. government would negotiate between labor and between management if you were an NRA member. And some people supported the NRA. They said it was a good compromise between labor and management. Others said it made the U.S. government too powerful to the point where the NRA is beating up Uncle Sam. Others would say that actually the NRA didn't go far enough. It was too pro-business and not pro-labor enough. But we're going to unpack the NRA in a moment. Now we'll unpack the NRA a little more. The National Recovery Administration, it was meant to help workers by negotiating deals between workers and labor unions and business interests. It also is meant to help business as well to prevent things like strikes and the closure of factories. Then the NRA also it creates new regulations like worker safety regulations for businesses, but it also relaxes some of the antitrust, anti-monopoly regulations that had been put into place in the progressive era. Again, it's a compromise between labor and management, between business and workers. And if you were compliant with the NRA, you got to display the Blue Eagle logo on your shop window. You could also display it on your newspaper or even on your in the credits of your film production. I've seen an NRA logo displayed. And supporters of the NRA would say it helps workers, it helps business, it's a compromise. Critics will say that the NRA it did too much to support big business because it relaxed antitrust legislation. They'll also say that the tens of thousands of pages of new regulations created by the NRA, big businesses can follow those regulations. Small businesses can't, and basically small businesses are going to be shut down in favor of big business. That it's corporatist, perhaps. Um, But there are business leaders that criticize it, most notably the really major industrial tycoon Henry Ford. But the biggest challenge that the NRA faced, though, was not from Henry Ford or from a big business. It was from a court case that involved a small business, and that was the Schechter Poultry case of 1935. Schechter Poultry was a kosher Jewish chicken processing plant. They had to slaughter and butcher chickens according to kosher practices, which were not in line with NRA regulations, and they were facing problems with the government, things like shutdowns, and they're going to appeal their case. It's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to rule that the NRA is unconstitutional. Um, the NRA, this was a pretty significant loss for the FDR administration, for the NRA to be challenged by the Supreme Court. This is something that really is going to bother FDR. In addition, another criticism as well of the NRA is that African Americans could not benefit from the NRA as much as white Americans could, because the Bureau does not work with sharecroppers or agricultural or domestic workers. It works with industrial workers and factory workers. And a lot of these industrial jobs, they were not open to African Americans. The unions that were in these shops, in many cases, did not allow black people to join. So in some ways, the NRA, even though it was helping workers, it was helping white workers more than it was helping black workers. This is another important piece of legislation related to labor in the New Deal era. This is the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Board Act. And it's a second New Deal policy from 1935. It's sponsored by Senator Robert Wagner, a Democrat from New York. This was significant pro-union protections in America, going far beyond what the NRA was doing. It included provisions like bans on company-controlled unions, and workers could not be fired for joining unions. Workers also gained the right to strike, even on company property. A strike, outside the picket line, it can be effective, but a strike on company property means that as long as you're striking, business is not happening, and management's going to have to negotiate with you if they want to get going and start making money again. You really see this in the General Motors United Auto Workers strike of 1938 under the Wagner Act. The UAW workers had the ability to strike in the plant, and that really strengthens their hand. Really, it tips the balance of power much more in favor of unions and organized labor than in favor of business. Historically, the U.S. government had either been neutral on labor disputes or had sided more with business and management. There are some other provisions to the NLRB. It allows for what are called closed shops and union shops. Closed shops are businesses where you have to join the union from day one. And some unions don't allow black people to join. They only allow white people to join. Union shops are businesses where you can work often for 90 or 100 days, but you have to join the union by the end of that period. Otherwise, you're out. You can be fired from your job. And again, that makes unions much more powerful because everybody in the job is going to be a union member. So if there's a strike, everybody's going to walk off the job. There's not going to be like 10% of the workers that are still there working. And so union membership is going to skyrocket after this act is passed. You can see from the slide here, you can see when the NLRB is passed in 1935. You can see union membership is 7 or 8%, and then within a couple of years, it's up, 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 up to the point where nearly 30% of American workers are in a union of some kind. And there, of course, are things that we could critique about the NLRB, that it gives too much power to organized labor, that it takes away freedom of association from workers. Workers went from being fired from being in a union to being fired for not being in a union. That basically choice. Workers, either way, they're losing choice, because you may not want to join a union, you may not want to have to pay those dues, you may not want to be told when you have to go on strike and when you go back to work. At the same time, there are a lot of benefits that are conferred to workers by being in unions, I will say as well. There's multiple sides to this issue, but the NLRB was challenged in 1937 in the NLRB versus Jones and McLaughlin Steel. In the Supreme Court, which had previously defanged the NRA, they upheld the NLRB, and people at the time said a switch in time saved the nine Supreme Court justices. They cited in favor of FDR's New Deal program, the Wagner Act, the NLRB, and they did this because they were concerned that FDR was going to increase the size of the Supreme Court. He was going to extend the court and fill it with pro-New Deal justices. That way he could get his legislation and it wouldn't be challenged in court anymore. And that basically the Supreme Court sided in favor of the Wagner Act to keep the court from being grown in size, to keep the court's composition from changing. In the end, though, FDR appoints 8 Supreme Court justices over his 4 terms as president of the United States, because he served 4 terms as president. The president appoints judges, and then the Senate confirms them. And this realigned the Supreme Court for many decades to come. Finally, significant portions of the Wagner Act, the NLRB, were reversed by the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. But union membership actually still remained very high even after the Wagner Act was weakened by the Taft-Hartley Act. Union membership will actually reach its highest point in the United States in the 1950s, not in the 1930s. It's after the 1950s. It's not just the Taft-Hartley Act that weakens unions. It's economic changes, it's technological changes, it's demographics and migration changes that cause union membership to decline to where it is at now, where it's well below 10% nowadays. So we've talked about labor, we've talked about the New Deal alphabet soup, and we've talked about daily life in the Great Depression. An important part of daily life is housing, and the New Deal had an impact on American housing policy as well. I'm going to start by talking about the FHA. The FHA is a controversial organization alongside things like the NRA. There's controversy. Basically what the FHA does, the Federal Housing Authority, is it offers mortgage insurance for American home buyers. That way more Americans can own homes. Banks will be more likely to loan out money if a mortgage is insurance backed. Granted, you have to pay fees to have that mortgage insurance. The thing about the FHA, though, is it's a national organization, but it's the disbursement of funds is handled by local boards. And these local boards, especially in the South, they will not insure mortgages to minority home buyers, especially to buyers who are trying to move into white neighborhoods. They don't want to encourage integration. They actually want to encourage segregation. In addition, the FHA is going to engage in a practice called redlining, in which the Bureau will not provide insurance to buyers who are buying in certain predominantly African American neighborhoods. In some cases, ethnic white or like Italian neighborhoods, for example, were included too. So the idea was these minority buyers were riskier buyers, and they would not be able to get this insurance for certain addresses. That was the thinking of the FHA, which we would argue this is prejudiced thinking. So if you're a minority buyer who wants to buy a home, in some cases you can only buy in a redlined area because of housing legal segregation policies in your local area. You're going to have to get a uninsured private mortgage, which might be on less favorable terms. It might have a higher interest rate. And that's going to make homeownership more expensive and more difficult than it would have been for a a white person of the same socioeconomic background, and ethnic whites not included, because in some cases ethnic whites also had a hard time with these redlining policies too, because not all white people, like Italians, for example, were seen as being white in the same way as someone from Northern Europe was, or of Northern European ancestry. And critics of the FHA argued that the effects of this racist policy will be felt for many decades to come, long after the 1930s. It's going to be easier for white Americans to move out to the suburbs than it will be for African Americans and other groups. And some would argue that these policies have stayed with us to the present. Although I'll also add that the U.S. government has made significant attempts to remediate these policies in the late 20th century and early 21st century. There's been attempts to help minority buyers, help buyers of lower incomes afford homes, because in America we believe that home ownership is a good thing, that your home is your home, but it can also be an investment as well, and that if you own the place that you live, there's going to be more opportunities for community and for civic engagements. We view home ownership as a good thing in America. There also are criticisms of the FHA, not only from African Americans, but from a lot of, you might say, more conservative economic historians who believe in a more limited government. They would argue that the offering of these loans and of easy money, it removed price ceilings for homes, and it normalized getting mortgages and going into debt to buy homes. And I think there is some truth to this as well. If more money is available for purchasing homes, people are going to be more likely to sell homes for more money. Buyers are willing to pay more, and they're going to go into debt. They're going to take on a mortgage to purchase this home, and it's better to not be in debt than it is to be in debt. I mean, if you have the money to buy something outright in cash versus to go into debt to buy it, for most people, it's better to buy it in cash if all things are equal, because then you're not dealing with having to pay interest. It's better to be paid interest than to be the one who's paying interest. And you really see this with the founding of Fannie Mae, actually, in 1938, which encourages increased investment in housing. And it really leads to Americans, in some cases, having to think of their home as not only a place to live, as their home, their domicile, but as an investment as well, because they paid so much money for this place. They need to make sure that when they sell it for retirement, they sell it for a good price to make it financially viable, considering how much they paid for it over the years. I should also add too that having a mortgage on your home or on your property, it's normalized today. That the FHA and Fannie Mae and housing policy in the 1930s normalized having a mortgage, but it wasn't always seen as a normal and an okay thing in the past. In the 19th century, having a mortgage on your home was actually seen as being something you wouldn't want to tell people. You were supposed to buy your home in cash, or go out west and get a homestead for free, or if you had to go into debt, you'd take out a loan from a family member or from a friend or a community member that you trusted, and you would pay them back very quickly without interest. Nowadays, the vast majority of Americans, when they're buying homes, they're going to have to buy them with a mortgage. So it normalizes going into debt to buy a home. That's something that perhaps more conservative leaning historians will say about the FHA and about New Deal housing policy, and many African Americans criticize some of the racist elements of the FHA and of redlining. Here are some images related to the Federal Housing Authority. The FHA had neighborhoods, or it divided up cities into neighborhoods. Green areas were considered to be the least risky, and they were generally white, affluent neighborhoods. Blue areas were the second most risky, and you could get a loan there, but it would perhaps not be on as good of terms. Yellow neighborhoods were riskier, and you might be able to get a loan if you were a white person buying in that area, but the terms were going to be worse. And red areas or redlined areas, you can see them in red, you would not be able to get a loan in those areas because those areas were overwhelmingly African American or in some cases ethnic white areas. And those communities were believed to not be, they're believed to be riskier buyers, and therefore they couldn't get these FHA loans. For people who couldn't afford to purchase a home, the New Deal also had public housing projects as well. And these projects were built across the country. One of the first and most important early public housing projects was in Atlanta, Georgia. And this was part of what was called slum clearance. Now, we wouldn't use this terminology today to describe the building of public housing projects. But that was acceptable terminology back in the 1930s. And so what happened was the Tan Yard Bottom neighborhood, which you can see on the left-hand side of this slide. This was a low-income area, rather run-down area, what you might call a slum, but it was racially integrated. It was poor white people and poor African Americans living together. Tan Yard Bottom was demolished, and it was replaced with a neighborhood called Techwood Homes. And you can see images of Techwood Homes on the right-hand side of this slide. These are multi-story, higher density apartment houses that replaced the detached homes that were there before. Really, these detached homes that you're seeing in the slides, they're a lot like boarding houses where multiple families might live together. They're kind of the apartment buildings before apartment buildings. And they're being replaced with these multi-story brick apartments, which were believed to be nicer and cleaner. And they did have modern utilities like indoor plumbing and electricity. So I'm not saying that these housing projects were all bad. There were many good and healthy things that were being brought in with these housing projects. The thing is, the new projects that are being built, they're going to be segregated. Techwood Homes, which replaces the Tan Yard Bottom area, is white only, and a black only project is going to be built called University Homes in 1937. They're called University Homes and Techwood Homes because they're very near the Georgia Tech campus in Atlanta. And basically, these government housing projects, they are reinforcing segregation. They're making segregation worse. They're taking a poor integrated area and replacing it with two segregated housing projects. In the end, Techwood Homes was demolished in 1996, and University Homes was demolished in 2009. Some of the original buildings have been preserved for historical purposes, but over time, these projects were underfunded. What happens in housing projects is the people who live there, their rent is capped at a percentage of their income, often 1/3 of their income. And in some cases, that's not enough money to maintain these buildings without additional government subsidy. And so these projects, they fall into disrepair over time. The plumbing systems get backed up, the heaters break down, and they become very, very not nice places to live, and they have to be demolished. In some cases, also you see increases in crime in these projects as well. I'm not saying that public housing shouldn't exist or that it's all bad. This was having indoor plumbing and having electricity is better than not having those things, and it's better than being homeless. But as I said, there are downsides with these housing projects. And one last downside that isn't really talked about in the 1930s, but is pointed out by later scholars and urban planners, is that social capital is lost when these neighborhoods are torn down and replaced with very sterile, boxy project buildings. The local culture is lost. Maybe ethnic traditions are lost when these neighborhoods are torn down and replaced with projects. So as with all New Deal policies, there's positives and there's negatives. Before I talk about a couple more New Deal programs, I want to highlight again that the New Deal can be controversial. It's been critiqued by people across the political spectrum. You even see this in discussions of art produced in the New Deal era, produced by the WPA, for example. A lot of the art produced by the WPA, it's in what is called the social realist style. and it's sometimes also called socialist realism or constructivism. Um, it features very boxy art. People are represented with sort of artificially geometric features. This is designed to show the strength of working people and of everyday people. You see this in Soviet art. You also see it in art styles from some other totalitarian regimes as well. But you see it in America. America was not a totalitarian regime in this period, but they're copying this social realism style. And you can see it in the images on the left-hand side. And again, there are critiques and criticisms of New Deal policies. The cartoons on the right-hand side show critiques of the New Deal, that it's inefficient, that it's too expensive, and that it's not sustainable. But I'm going to show a few images of art related to the New Deal and other art styles from this period over the next couple of slides. I think there's many similarities between the social realism that you see in New Deal, especially WPA art, and the artwork that's produced by artists in fascist Italy. There is similarity in the very geometric, almost superhero-esque portrayal of human subjects in American social realism and in the social constructive artwork that you see in fascist Italy. You can look at the mosaic here from Rome in 1937 and see the similarity, and you can see it in this piece from 1942, which features Il Duce Benito Mussolini. By the way, FDR studied totalitarian regimes. He studied what the Soviets were doing and what the fascists in Italy were doing. He also studied the Nazis as well. He had an interest more in what was happening in Italy and in the Soviet Union than what was happening in Germany. And Mussolini actually had some admiration for FDR, which is interesting. He thought that FDR was a very effective leader at mobilizing the American people. This is a mural from the Cincinnati train station. It's a large dome building, and this mural is very similar, I think, to the art that's being produced in fascist Italy. It's that social realist style. It's showing American workers across time, just like the Italian artwork was showing Italian, what would have been modern Italian fascist soldiers alongside Roman legionaries. And there's a similarity here with portrayals of Native Americans and frontiersmen and soldiers from the Revolutionary War alongside contemporary American workers. Here are some images related to ephemera from the 1930s and from the Soviet Union. There are some similarities between the ephemera artwork in the US and the USSR. Now, ephemera is artwork on handbills, posters, manifestos. It's not meant to be saved the way like a mural is meant to be saved and looked at for many years to come. It's called ephemera because it's ephemeral. And the image on the right is actually from Uzbekistan in the USSR. It's from 1933, and it says, strengthen working discipline in collective farms. And this is WPA artwork that shows the importance of working together. FDR and the New Dealers were very pro-work. They wanted as close to full employment as possible for the American people. They were not just trying to get people to be lazy. They were trying to get people to work, as were the Soviets during this period. And there's a similarity in their artwork as well. And again, there are some similarities between ephemera, temporary art, in the Soviet Union and in the United States, especially art related to work in the WPA. This art is designed to mobilize people. You might even say to propagandize them. But it has to be simple to convey a simple message to working people. If you get hurt on the job, make sure you get your injuries treated properly. Join the WPA, get job training, and support your country. The Soviet artwork is conveying a very similar message. There were some similarities and overlaps between the policies in Nazi Germany and in the New Deal United States. Um, FDR was aware of what was happening around the world, and leaders around the world were aware of what FDR was up to as well. Um, there has been arguments have been made that Nazi artwork is the least similar, the most dissimilar, that is, most different from the artwork of the New Deal era. But I actually think there is some similarities between Nazi artwork and the social realism that you see in the United States and in fascist Italy and in the Soviet Union. The Nazis did not like so-called modern abstract art. They saw it as degenerate and that it should be suppressed. But I do think there is some social realism in some of their propaganda art because the Nazis did believe in glorifying the worker, especially the German worker. This is a Richard Spitz painting from 1933. It's called The Nazi Vision of Greatness, and it shows very geometric figures looking to the sky and looking to the Nazi symbols of the swastika, and they're featured in very muscular, very geometric proportions. The human figures in this painting. This piece of artwork, I think, is reminiscent of some of the WPA murals. It's a piece that's meant to memorialize Hitler's initial beer hall putsch in 1923 when he tried to take over the country in the 20s and failed and was arrested in prison. Here you see him with his supporters, Nazi Party supporters, being stopped by the German Weimar Republic military. And this is some more similarities between art that's coming out of America and social realism, and even between Nazi artwork. On the right, you have Norman Rockwell's Freedom of Speech painting, part of the Four Freedoms series that was described by President FDR in 1941, and a Nazi piece of visual art called You Have Won in the end. They're glorifying the working man, the common man, in both of these artwork styles. Granted, Norman Rockwell was opposed to fascism, he was opposed to Nazism. His four freedoms extolled freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, values that were antithetical to the values of Nazi Germany. I'm certainly not saying that Norman Rockwell was a Nazi supporter, not at all. We do have art that's designed to convey a message today in the world. It's different than the social realism of the 1930s, but it does have that mobilizing, message conveying, even propagandistic element. You see this in a lot of corporate art. It's called the corporate Memphis style. Sometimes it's called the big tech art style because it's often used by tech companies like YouTube. It's meant to be very international and relatable to people from many ethnic backgrounds and people of different races, and it's meant to be to convey a message to people who speak a variety of languages. Sometimes it's called the Globo Homo art style, which is a portmanteau of globalized homogenization that they're trying to create. Although it's very colorful, it's actually kind of very bland and generic art that's going to work anywhere in the world. Nowadays, it's produced more by corporations rather than governments, but this style's been around since the 1980s, and it was, popular well into the 2010s. You still see it in the 2020s, but I think people are kind of tired of it. Even though it's called corporate Memphis, it's not actually from Memphis. It's actually developed in Italy, and it's to me it just looks very generic. Unlike the social realism of the 1930s, it just looks very blah to me. And I'd much rather look at the art from the 1930s, even if I don't agree with the ideologies, whether it's communism, fascism, or Nazism. It's more interesting to look at and study as a historian than the stuff that's being put out today. It's going to be very interesting to see what AI is going to do to artwork in the future, particularly this corporate message conveying propagandistic form of art. So now that my discussion of artwork is completed, I want to talk about the Social Security system. This is a program that's still in effect today. People talk about how it's going to go away in the future, but it is still with us. So, for context, in the 1930s, Many families were struggling to take care of their elderly relatives, their grandparents, their great-grandparents that were living at home, and they had to have some very difficult conversations about what do we do to help our senior relatives. Also, it's very difficult for elderly people to retire, to leave the workforce to make way for younger workers. Not every elderly person has a pension or savings to help them when they retire, and this is where the Social Security Act comes in. It was sometimes it's called old age insurance in the language of the 1930s, and it was supposed to help senior citizens, people over the age of 65, to be able to retire and to leave the workforce, and to make way for younger workers. Really, it's going to ease the burden of caring for elderly relatives. It's going to allow workers to retire, and it's going to make way for young workers coming up. The taxes are first collected in 1937. Initially, it was a 1% contribution from employees, or deduction for employees, and then a 1% deduction for employers. Some people argue that these taxes being taken out, they will contribute to the 1937 recession. People don't want to spend as much because they know that this money is tax money they're going to have to pay later. Or when they did receive their tax bill, they didn't know what to do. They struggled to pay it, and they didn't buy as many other goods. So then that led to a recession in 1937. Other factors probably motivated the 1937 recession as well, though. There was no withholding yet from your paycheck. Withholding actually develops during World War II. The first monthly Social Security check was paid out to a woman named Ida Fuller from Vermont. She received this check in 1940. It was for about $22.54, about $510 today. The average 2025 payout is $1,976 per month, but not everybody gets that much out of their Social Security. It's supposed to be based on how much you contribute and how long you work. For example, if you are a stay-at-home parent or a mother, for example, that stays at home, um, you're not going to get very much from Social Security. Even though you've been working for your family, you are not contributing to it, so you're not going to get as much out of it, or only for the years that you worked outside of the home. Agricultural workers and domestic workers as well initially were not contributing to Social Security, and therefore did not get Social Security payouts when they retired. There were some other plans that were proposed as well to help take care of elderly people. A doctor named Dr. Francis Townsend from California, he proposed a much more generous plan. He proposed a $200 a month payout, or about $4,000 a month. And he proposed it for anyone over the age of 60. And the only caveat was you had to spend all of that money within 1 month. And this program would not be funded by employee and employer contributions, but by a 2% national sales tax, not a state or local sales tax, a national sales tax. That plan ended up not going through. We went with the Social Security plan instead, which it was sold to the American people as not being the same as a full paycheck. It was supplementary income. It was supposed to help with anything else you had saved during your lifetime, and it was supposed to help money and resources you got from your family. So that was how it was explained to the American people. And the idea was you paid into the system, the U.S. government would invest that money, and then it would be able to return a larger sum to you when you retired. Basically an investment plan, you might say. The thing is, life expectancy was lower in the 1930s and 40s than it was today. At birth, life expectancy was, for women, it was 62 to 66. For males, it was 58 to 62. That doesn't mean that, most men died between 58 and 62, and most women died 62 to 66. It just means that fewer people were living to collect Social Security back then than nowadays. You'd be paying into the system, but then you may not live to collect. The life expectancy at birth today, though, for women is about 80, and men it's about 75. So if you live to 80, you could be collecting for 15 years, or in some cases more, if you can elect to collect Social Security as early as 62, but you don't get as much money then. Concerns, detractions, Nowadays, you have a much larger percent of your income deducted, 6.2% on average, and people are living a lot longer as well. They're going to be collecting for longer. And also, our proportions, our demographics have changed in America. We have a much larger senior citizen population now. During the 1930s, when this program was developed, only about 9 million or 6% of Americans were seniors. Now there's about 63 million, or 18% of the population are senior citizens because the baby boom, the largest generation in American history, they are either geriatric or they're all going to be geriatric by the year 2030. Um, and so there's going to be perhaps too many people collecting and not enough people paying into the system. There were also some Supreme Court cases basically that said that in reality, you're not contributing the money you contribute to Social Security. You're not guaranteed to get it out. Basically, it's becoming more of a system like a pension where it's paid for by future generations. Your retirement benefits are actually not your benefits grown over time. They're benefits that your children or grandchildren might be paying for you through their work. This leads to the question of, is Social Security sustainable? Will taxes have to increase to cover it? Probably. They already have increased. Will retirement ages have to be raised? Probably. There's talk of people born after certain cutoff dates. They will have to wait longer to collect Social Security. So I'm not saying that Social Security is going away. What I'm saying is changes are going to have to be made to ensure that it's sustainable. And if you're a young person, you should consider setting up alternate retirement accounts, 401ks, and things like that. That way, you're prepared if the Social Security payout you get is not as much. And that's not financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor. That's just general life advice that I would give to someone as a historian. National minimum wage is also implemented during the 1930s, during the New Deal era as well. It was called the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This is a second New Deal policy. And the first minimum wage was about 25 cents an hour. That would have about the purchasing power of $5 an hour. That's based on 2023 numbers. Um, and people talk about the minimum wage, how it should be raised, how you can't live on the minimum wage nowadays. You would have been hard pressed to live on the minimum wage in the 1930s as well. There's times where proportionally the minimum wage, adjusting for inflation, was higher than it is today, and there's times where proportionally, considering costs, it was lower than it is today. And I'm not saying that the minimum wage should be at a certain level, that it's too high or it's too low. I've worked jobs where I was paid about that wage, and it was tight, I will definitely say. So other provisions of the FLSA are child labor is going to be outlawed except in agriculture, because many children who work on farms are working on their family's farm. It's part of their domestic chores. The progressives back at the turn of the century had wanted to outlaw child labor, as well as organized labor unions wanted to outlaw child labor as well, and that's going to be accomplished by the FLSA, which also gives us the minimum wage. Some would argue that the minimum wage law, it contributed to the 1937 to 1938 recession because now employers had to pay their workers more money. It's still not a lot of money, but they had to pay them more. And we could also argue that certain Federal Reserve policies and reduced government spending and tax increases that were happening at about the same time also contributed to this 37 to 38 recession. FDR, he remained popular even after the 37 to 38 recession, but this recession, which damaged a still recovering economy, it shattered that aura of invincibility that FDR had about himself. He still was popular. He's still going to win 2 more re-elections, but he didn't have the kind of carte blanche that he had before this recession, before the 37 to 38 recession. In addition, FDR's talk of packing the Supreme Court, of enlarging it, also made him look bad. It made him look even almost dictatorial in some cases. So after 37 to 38, FDR is still going to be popular, but he's not going to be able to do quite as much, which this is why many historians say that the third New Deal was less extensive than the first and the second New Deal, because FDR just didn't have the power after 1937 and 1938. Also, as time goes on, remember, the United States has to start getting ready for World War II. The New Deal is going to take a back seat to preparing for that global conflict. This is a good opportunity to talk about the public response to FDR. The New Deal programs were very popular amongst everyday Americans. While there were criticisms to be had um, from both the left and from the right, the average American supported FDR and supported these policies. And you can see that in the 1936 and 1940 elections, particularly in 1936. FDR wins the majority of the popular vote. He wins 60% of the popular vote. That's a landslide. He wins the majority of the Electoral College. He wins 46 of the 48 states. The Republicans basically ran a guy named Alf Landon, this really unknown politician, almost like a nobody politician from Kansas, basically as a sacrificial lamb, because they didn't want to, run an important candidate who would lose. They had to run somebody. And in 1940, FDR, he's still very powerful, but he's not quite as invincible. He wins with almost 55% of the popular vote. But he begins to lose some of those Midwestern states, those farming states. The farmers that were in FDR's New Deal coalition, some of them begin to back away from him. He was seen as having gone a little bit too far, having flown too close to the sun, if you want to make a Greek mythological reference. He ran against Wendell Willkie, a Republican, and Wendell Willkie was still perceived as being the rich man's candidate. Some supporters of Wendell Willkie, they said, well, there is some real grassroots support for him, but more wise political observers like Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who was actually a relative of FDR's. She was actually very politically conservative at this point in her life, but she said, no, Willkie's not going to win. There's no grassroots support for him. The only grassroots support for Willkie is from 1,000 country clubs. It's a paraphrase of what she said. So FDR is still popular in the 1940 election, but he's not as invincible anymore, and Congress is going to be more divided and less likely to back him, which is why the third New Deal was less aggressive and less transformational. And of course, from 1940 on, FDR has to focus more on getting America ready for World War II, and he will eventually win the 1944 re-election campaign as well. One last thing to note on this slide, you'll notice that in 1936, he's still running with John Nance Garner, but Garner is going to be replaced with Henry Wallace for the 1940 election. Garner was a conservative, more of a limited government, white Southern Democrat. He had become more opposed to FDR as time went on, to the point of almost becoming an obstructionist, and he was replaced with Henry Wallace, who was a Midwesterner, but also much more left-leaning, and really in some ways to the left of FDR. We're beginning to wrap up this video, and I want to talk about FDR's political ideology a bit more, because he's a very complex, very nuanced figure. And as I said before, he was not an especially deep thinker. This doesn't mean that he was stupid, but he was very flexible and really not wedded specifically too much to one political ideology over the other. He was very pragmatic. And really, if you were to pin down FDR and his political views, I would describe him as a turn-of-the-century progressive, someone who wants to regulate the economy and smooth out the rough edges of capitalism, as they would have said at that time in history. And he was very pragmatic, so turn-of-the-century progressive and pragmatist. He does go on to really help create modern American liberalism, though, both in the social and political sense. Modern American liberalism is different than the classical liberalism of the Founding Fathers. Modern American liberalism means social liberalism, live how you want, live a more unconventional lifestyle even. You can see this in FDR's religious beliefs and in his relationship with his wife, Eleanor. But then the government will provide social safety nets to help those who are in need of assistance, who are in a bad situation. So it means a government that's a bit more expansive, but it's not going to interfere in your personal life. That's essentially what modern American liberalism is. And it's different than the limited government liberalism espoused by many of the founding fathers. And FDR supported a lot of progressive era policies because he had been a part of the progressive era, and he was able to implement policies that I think would have been seen as being too radical before the Depression, that would not have been successful in the 1920s in a period of very conservative politics and very pro-business politics. The progressives before the 1920s, some were more capitalistic, some were more radical, but they often believed in mixing a bit of capitalism and a bit of socialism to have a mixed economy that was more regulated and was more centrally managed to deal with social problems. In spite of what some people might say, FDR was not a communist. He was very pragmatic. He did work with communist leaders like Joseph Stalin in World War II, and he was not really truly a socialist either. He believed in a capitalist system. He did have some socialistic beliefs, I'll say, but he was not a true socialist. He still believed in a capitalist system, just with a lot more regulations and a lot more management from the federal government. And he wasn't a fascist either. He opposed the fascists. As time went on, he may have learned some things from fascist leaders, especially Mussolini in Italy. But when as time went on, as those countries became more opposed to the United States, FDR became opposed to them as well. He was a pragmatist more than anything else, and he did receive some support from more radical leaders like Stalin and like Mussolini. Mussolini had some very positive things to say about FDR, although as time goes on, Mussolini liked him less, and Stalin and FDR became friendlier during the World War II years as they had a common enemy. And on a personal level, FDR was not too wed to any specific political philosophy. I don't think he was an especially deep thinker, as I've mentioned before. He did study radical political ideologies and the leaders that supported himself. And some of the people in his cabinet, his brain trust of academics, some of them were more socialist leaning, especially people like his second vice president, Henry Wallace, who replaced John Nance Garner. And so on the question of politics, where does FDR in this New Deal fall? Was he more conservative? Was he more liberal? Was he more progressive? Conservatism being a stand-in for right wing, liberal being a sort of a synonym for left wing. By the standards of the 1930s, FDR's programs would be considered liberal or left-leaning. It's a more expansive federal government. It's more involved in the general welfare. It's more regulatory. Although many of FDR's actions, though today, would not be considered very liberal or very progressive. Programs like the FHA that excluded African Americans, the NRA, which often excluded African Americans, Social Security, which did not include agricultural and domestic workers, which were disproportionately, those jobs were done by African Americans. Those sort of things would not be considered liberal or progressive at all today. But FDR is, of course, critiqued by people on the left side of politics and people on the right side of politics as well. But FDR, he does really help to found modern American liberalism, and he moves the Democratic Party in a more national liberal direction. More conservative elements of the Democratic Party are going to be minimized in power as time goes on. Regressive, reactionary elements of the Democratic Party are also going to be minimized as time goes on. Thanks in part to FDR and the New Deal coalition of voters that he helps to create. But as I said, there are some very left-wing people that criticize FDR. They say he did not do enough to stop big business, that he gave too many compromises and concessions to business. And on his own beliefs, FDR said, "I am a juggler. I never let my left hand know what my right hand is up to." And this is a reference to his pragmatic way of doing things, his balancing of left and right, of his own pragmatism and some of the old ideas from the progressive era. This is Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black of Alabama. He was an FDR appointee, and he was a well-known former KKK member, very high-ranking KKK member as well. And he was one of the Supreme Court nominees that FDR chose. He was a staunch supporter of the New Deal as well, and he's a white Southern Democrat. FDR needed to make sure that white Southern Democrats continued to support him, so Hugo Black was a natural choice for that, and a very pragmatic choice. Again, I'm not saying FDR was a KKK supporter. I'm saying he was a pragmatist, and he's looking to add Supreme Court justices that are going to keep parts of his voter coalition happy, and that are going to, you could say, rubber stamp the New Deal. And this cartoon, which is more disparaging of FDR, shows him packing the court with Supreme Court justices, which eventually he does do because he's president for so long, for 4 terms. They say you know a person by their friends and by their enemies. So I want to talk about some of the friends and enemies that FDR had. I'm going to start with former supporters of his that became opponents. On the left is Charles Coughlin. He was an Irish Catholic priest from Detroit. He actually was Canadian born, but he was of Irish ancestry. And he had an immensely popular radio show. He was sort of a Catholic, almost televangelist, but he was really to the left of Roosevelt on a lot of economic issues, and he was also a bit more populistic than FDR was. In FDR, he did have a desire to help the poor and the working class, but I would not consider FDR really to be a populist. He was very urbane. He was very much from the elite. Coughlin was a populist and a man of the people. Thing is, though, he breaks from FDR because he didn't think that FDR was radical enough in his economic policies, and he also was very anti-Semitic and isolationist, far more so than FDR and the New Dealers were. And he actually eventually becomes a very critical, very vocal critic of FDR and of the United States in World War II either, as well. Um, And we also have Joseph Kennedy, the father of JFK, future President John F. Kennedy. And Joseph Kennedy was more of a pro-business person that supported FDR. He helped to establish the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. But as time went on, Joe Kennedy and FDR broke from each other. Um, he thought that FDR was being too anti-business. Also, Kennedy began to develop more isolationist and anti-Semitic views as well, to the point where he was you know, talking about how Britain had no chance. Democracy was finished in Britain, Joe Kennedy said in reference to the beginning of World War II. As time goes on, though, Joe Kennedy goes from being a friend of FDR's to being an enemy of FDR's to being kind of a friend of FDR's again. He will eventually support the American war effort. He will actually work to get FDR reelected in 1944. FDR had to be very careful about having open anti-Semites supporting him, though, because Jewish voters were an important part of the New Deal coalition. Although we can criticize FDR for his stances on Jews as well. He denied Jewish refugees asylum in the United States during World War II, even though they were being persecuted by the Nazis. And of course, we can also criticize people like Joe Kennedy, particularly for the treatment of his daughter, Rosemary. His daughter was lobotomized because she was not a well-behaved woman, we would say, which that was not the right thing to do to her. That procedure, really horrific, barbaric operation that they were doing in the early 20th century, it basically left her with the intellect of a toddler. Really, really sad, awful story. But the Kennedy family, there's all kinds of mystery and mythology and skeletons in the closet, as you're going to see in future videos. FDR is purported to have said that the two most dangerous men in America were Huey Long, left on this slide, and Douglas MacArthur at right. Huey Long was the former Democratic governor of Louisiana, and then he eventually became senator for Louisiana. And in many ways, he was the left of Roosevelt. He was more in favor of mass wealth redistribution. He makes that very clear in his speeches and in his Every Man a King campaign. In some ways, he was much more populistic than FDR in the way he spoke. He really tried to act and sound like a man of the people, whereas FDR was much more aristocratic and urbane in his style. Initially, Huey Long supported the New Deal, but came to oppose it over time. He did believe in a big government that was involved in the general welfare, but he believed it should be state governments, not the federal government. So that led him into conflict with FDR. But the two men disagreed just in personal style and how they did things as well. On one occasion, Huey Long visited the president at the White House, and he broke certain protocol and didn't show proper upper class manners. He refused to take off his hat when he went inside the White House. He insisted on calling FDR Frank instead of Mr. President, and really just annoyed FDR and really got under his skin. Long's family claimed that Huey Long planned to run for president in 1936 as a third-party candidate. He wouldn't have been able to win, but he might have taken enough votes away from FDR and the Democrats to swing the election for the Republicans. But he doesn't run in the 36 election because he was assassinated in 1935 by the son of a Louisiana political rival. There's a lot of unusual things, a lot of irregularities that happened with Huey Long's assassination. Some more conspiracy-minded people might have suggested that perhaps FDR had something to do with his assassination. There's no evidence, no credible evidence of that I've seen. It was just Huey Long had made a lot of enemies on his way up in Louisiana politics. He was a very corrupt governor. They called him the Kingfish in Louisiana politics before he became a senator for the state. On the other side of things, Douglas MacArthur, who we've talked about before, he had served as FDR's chief of staff. He was a conservative and more of a Republican. He opposed big government spending. He opposed most of the New Deal programs. And he often disagreed with FDR about foreign policy and about military budget cuts. Really, he wanted, the only thing that he wanted big spending on was the military, basically, to put it simply. And in one very tense exchange between MacArthur and FDR, FDR was looking to cut the budget. MacArthur was opposing that. MacArthur lost his cool and said that when we're losing the next war, I want people to know that it's not because of me. It's because of what you've done, President FDR. And this remark angered FDR so much that he said, "You will not speak to the president in this way." He referred to himself as the third person. This is also coming from MacArthur's own memoirs. So, and MacArthur himself paraphrased what was said in this conversation. But again, it highlights who FDR's greatest opponents were. He had opponents on both the left and the right. And I should add as well that even if MacArthur and FDR disagreed with each other, they did eventually develop a working relationship again during the Second World War. This is a slide about the New Deal coalition that FDR helps to create with his New Deal policies. And this coalition is going to be in effect for most of the fifth party system. It's really going to start to break up in the 1960s, but there were some signs of cracks in the picture window even before the 1960s. And these images represent the coalition. At the top left is Marian Anderson, an African-American singer and performer. She performed at the Lincoln Memorial to support the Roosevelts and to challenge segregation. And FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was very involved in bringing African Americans to the side of the Democratic Party and to the side of FDR. Her outreach was very good, and she was also involved in a lot of human rights activism and things like that as well. First ladies have often had political beliefs, but I would say Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the most significant, historically significant first ladies we've ever had, especially in terms of her political activism. To the right, you have an image of a working class farming family, the Cook family of Iowa. They represent Western farmers. Western farmers, they entered the coalition because they liked FDR's agricultural policies. They needed assistance. They're going to be one of the first groups though to leave the New Deal coalition. They're going to really begin to leave in the 1940s and return to voting more for the Republican Party. White Southerners also are still voting for the Democratic Party during this period in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. But there's signs that the Democratic Party is over time not going to do as well with white Southern voters. Down at the bottom, we have urban voters, in some cases urban ethnic voters, the Jewish American voters in urban centers, even though FDR had in many ways angered Jewish voters by refusing to accept Jewish refugees during World War II. Jewish American voters traditionally have voted for the Democratic Party, and many ethnic voters in big cities will vote for the Democratic Party to this day. And the last group on this slide are union industrial workers. These are UAW, United Auto Workers supporters. And over time, the Democratic Party had been closer with unions than the Republican Party had been. But legislation like the Wagner Act, which greatly strengthened the power of unions, is really going to appeal to industrial workers and union members who are going to be a very strong lock for the Democratic Party. Not exclusively, but they're going to be a pretty strong voter bloc, and they're going to be a part of the New Deal coalition for many years to come. But the New Deal coalition, of course, is going to really break up in the 1960s, and there's going to be signs that it's going to start to break up even a little bit before the 60s. This is just one last slide before the conclusion. The Great Depression is a depressing time in American history, but America did achieve some of its greatest sports moments in the 1930s. For example, on the left slide image, you have Jesse Owens, the track and field athlete, an African-American athlete. He won 4 gold medals in the 1936 Berlin Olympics, challenging Nazi beliefs about race, and also, just proving the determination and the grit of African Americans, that they deserved equality. And on the right-hand side of the slide is the U.S. Soccer team. They actually finished 3rd place in the 1930 World Cup. It's the best performance in soccer by the United States. United States men's team. United States women's teams have done very well, but the United States men's team historically has struggled in the World Cup and in international play. Conclusion. We've talked about FDR, his political beliefs. We've talked about some of the most important New Deal programs. Now we're going to talk about, to wrap things up, did the New Deal get America out of the Great Depression? There's a lot of debate here. The verdict today, I would say, amongst both left-leaning and right-leaning scholars, is that the New Deal really did not get us completely out of the Great Depression. It did mitigate many of the negative effects of the Great Depression, and it helped people in a difficult time. Left-leaning scholars tend to say that the New Deal did not do enough to recover the economy, to control, to centrally manage the American economy. Right-leaning scholars say that it went too far, and it got in the way of the free market economy and prevented it from recovering on its own. I'm not going to say which side is really correct, because it's debatable. The utility of the New Deal, they both agree, though, is that it does redefine everyday Americans' relationship and their expectations from the U.S. government, specifically from the national U.S. government. It goes beyond things that were happening in the progressive era in terms of management of the economy and dealing with social problems. The government's really going to be involved very actively in promoting the general welfare, as the preamble of the Constitution says. And the New Deal, I also think, and this is a strength of the New Deal, is it keeps the United States from adopting radical political ideologies during the 1930s. Many countries, especially in Europe, Western Europe especially, they're going to turn to the extreme left or the extreme right on political issues, as they're looking for solutions to deal with economic challenges, to deal with social problems. You have um, the rise of fascist Italy, the rise of nationalist Spain in the 1920s and 1930s. You have the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union becomes much more totalitarian in the 1930s under Joseph Stalin. Even Britain and France adopt more extreme political ideologies during the 1930s as they deal with the Depression. But you don't see that in America. You don't have a communist revolution or a socialist revolution in America. You don't have a successful fascist revolution or government overthrow in America. You have that business plot that basically went nowhere. And FDR's policies in the New Deal, it helped everyday Americans feel like they were being assisted by their government, that their government cared about them, that they had a place at the table, and it prevents political radicalism in America. I would also say, too, that it helps to also create a lot of social trust in America. Trust for the government, trust for institutions, and just trust between various groups of Americans. I think social trust had been increasing since the 1920s, but it really increases in the 1930s, and some scholars say that changes to American government in the 1920s, which I'll get into in future videos, and the New Deal, it helps to create a era of social trust in America that it lasts really until the late 1960s, early 1970s. But we'll talk more about this era of social trust in future videos. But that's the New Deal. Did it get America out of the Depression 100%? I don't think so. Did it mitigate some of the negative effects of the Great Depression? Yes, it did. Did it help many people? Yes, it did. Are many of these programs still around today? Yes, they are. The greatest strength of the New Deal, though, is I think it helped Americans feel that their government cared about them. It redefined Americans' relationship with the government and with the state, and it helped to usher in that era of social trust that's going to last for um, really for the entire kind of middle decades of the 20th century.